no matter what this future turns out to be, we will all share it. So John Powers, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Go get him, Tiger.
It is my pleasure.
And then I'm going to take it.
You guys are still on mic. To introduce Mike Brune, Executive Director of the Sierra Club, America's largest and most influential grassroots environmental organization, in case you didn't know. In 1993, Mike earned a dual degree in economics and finance from Westchester University in Pennsylvania. Mike's first environmental job was working as an organizer for Greenpeace. With 4 years of grassroots organizing and campaign experience, Mike moved to the Rainforest Action Network in 1998 to lead its forest products campaign. As an example of Mike's ingenuity, he conceived one of the market-based programs to stop the cutting of old-growth forests, redwood trees, which is being perpetrated, in effect, by Boise Cascade, which was a privately held company. So much as we might like to do shareholder actions against Boise Cascade, that wasn't an option. So Mike came up with the clever idea of stopping demand by choking the supply chain. And they targeted, Rainforest Action Network did, Home Depot. So ran Depot's PA system in a store. Mike got a hold of the microphone and made the announcement. Quick, go to aisle 9. Get the last of the redwood forest while it's still available, being sold by Home Depot. So at the same time, there was a shareholder action against Home Depot to try to get them, through the shareholder vote, to stop selling old-growth forests. And together, the campaign succeeded. And Time magazine called that the victory, the most important environmental story of 1999. Next came Lowe's, then Kinko's. Rand went on to win more than a dozen other key commitments from some of America's largest corporations. In 2003, Mike became executive director of Rand. Now this is key. Despite Rand's strong-arm tactics, Mike's approach usually left his adversaries feeling that they had been treated with respect. Quoting Mike, "We had a mantra at Rand to be hard on the issues but soft on the people involved. That's really just another way of saying that when you take on a company, it's possible to be confrontational and collaborative at the same time." While at Rand, Mike wrote Coming Clean, Breaking America's Addiction to Oil and Coal, which addresses climate disruption and lays out a plan for moving America to a clean energy economy. In 2010, Mike left Rand to become executive director of the Sierra Club. Just over a year later, Bloomberg Philanthropies awarded a 4-year, $50 million grant to the club for its Beyond Coal campaign, which I hope most of you have heard about, to accelerate the retirement of 1/3 of the nation's aging coal fleet by 2020 and accelerate the transition to a cleaner, cost-effective, energy source-based economy. A quick look at the campaign's website. A month ago, the biggest wind power deal ever was concluded. The first U.S. offshore wind farm is complete. Montana's 2 dirty coal units will retire. North Dakota's ancient dirty coal plant will retire. Alaska and Oakland, no more coal exports. New York commits to clean energy standard. Illinois judge orders dirty coal plant to clean up. Ohio, coal plants will be retired instead of bailed out. And the Southwest U.S. national parks will be addressed for their haze problems. He's leading the club to take stances on immigration rights, social justice, Black Lives Matter, and diversifying the Sierra Club itself, which is 97% white. And he's engaging next generation of activists. Others have expressed that Mike should confine his leadership to environmental issues and climate, but Mike's vision understands that protecting the habitability of the planet is a complex web that requires a breadth and collaboration across it. He's living that our necessary solutions aren't coming from the political left or the political right. They'll come from all of us pulling together in the present, taking the long-term view of the future. And there's more to Mike than his social change side. He's a devoted husband and prioritizes his family. Mike consistently gets home to dinner with his wife, Mary, a technical writer and co-founder of the group Making Our Milk Safe, Moms, and their children, Olivia, Sebastian, and Genevieve. And then after dinner, after he spent the time with the family, he continues working. That's Mike Brune. Mike's friends describe him as kind and loving father and friend. He shows up with kindness and laughter and manages to be thoughtful. So I can encourage you all to go out for a beer with Mike later and hear some more of his stories. And I ask you to join me in welcoming one of this country's most effective activists, climate thought leaders, and environmental authors, Mike Brune.
Wow. Thank you. That might be the best introduction I've ever written. Just kidding. Let me just keep track of time here. So, well, first, thank you, John. That was a great introduction. I really appreciate it. And you are all welcome to come out for drinks tonight. John is going to be buying, so please all come out. May also just thank Dan, who simultaneously said he was looking forward to my presentation and saying he was going to take a nap. So I hope that both things don't happen, at least while I'm talking. And then also to David Orr and all the conference organizers for bringing us all together. There's a lot of ideas and a lot of inspiration that's here in this room. So I, for one, have learned a bunch this morning from Mark Campanale, Bill Becker, Bill Ritter, Nikki. I've learned a lot from Nikki over the years, and I bet a lot of us have found some inspiration and new ideas and new perspectives. So I just want to, let's give it up for the people who put this conference together. I should start with a bit of a confession that I've been to Ohio 3 times so far this year, and the last time I was in Ohio, I was speaking at a Blue-Green Alliance conference, and it was during the NBA playoffs. And I may have made a remark about, this was during the finals of the playoffs, when Golden State Warriors were playing the Cleveland Cavaliers, and I may have made a remark because when I was visiting there, the Golden State Warriors were up 3-1. I may have done a little bit of trash talking. So maybe you shouldn't even believe anything that I'm going to say for the next half hour, because clearly I don't have a sense of where the future is going, at least in terms of basketball. But I digress. So I just wanted to be clear at the outset that this is not likely to be a conversation where I throw out some ideas. The title of this talk, I believe, is Beyond Left and Right. So just to be clear, I am not going to throw out my top suggestions for the key words or the key phrases or the right messengers to finally unlock bipartisan support. I do think that there are many people who have done a fantastic job at figuring out how can conservatives and progressives or people living in rural or urban areas, people on different parts of embracing different perspectives, how we can talk and listen to each other. And I do think that that work's important. But that's not what this particular conversation, I hope, is about. It certainly won't be what you're hearing from me. Because I think that what our bigger challenge is to break out of the left-right conundrum, the prison that we find ourselves in, and find a way, as John was saying, to move way out in front. And I think the realities of what's happening in this country, economically, politically, socially, and what's happening around the world give us both an obligation and an opportunity to break the barriers of that political spectrum. But first, let me just talk a little bit and share my thoughts on where we are right now, because I think having an accurate, holistic perspective on the fate of the presence of our movement and the progress that we've made around the country on climate and energy issues really should inform our ability to reach out and to build a much broader coalition. So you heard John talk a little bit about the Beyond Coal campaign, which is the largest effort by the Sierra Club in our 124-year history. But to be clear, this is not at all just a Sierra Club campaign. There are literally hundreds of organizations, large national organizations like Earth Justice and NRDC, and many others, and then what the main topic from a climate and energy perspective, 200 new coal plants were proposed in almost every state across the country, which if they were built would have locked in coal as the dominant source of electricity production for the next 50 years. Because when you build a coal plant, it's awfully expensive. It takes 30, 40, 45 years operating almost 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year for decades simply to pay it off. And together, a community of activists led by local communities worked together to stop almost more than 90% of these coal plants from ever being built. That helped to usher in the next phase of this work. If you were to go back 6 years ago, we had 523 existing coal plants that were already operating, many of whom have been operating since the 70s or the 60s, some of which have been operating since the 50s and 40s and 1930s. A couple coal plants were built before the last time the Chicago Cubs won the World Series. It's a long time ago. And over the last 6 years, that same movement, which is now arguably the most experienced, most sophisticated, most powerful part of our movement of any part of the environmental community in history, that movement has secured the retirement of more than half of the existing coal plants in this country. Half of the coal plants that were operating in 2010 have either now been retired or are on a mandated schedule to be retired in the next couple years. And all of that has happened just since 2010. And then, of course, if you look at the progress that we're making, not just on coal, but on fossil fuels generally, all around the country, is enormous. And almost everybody here has probably been a part of that, right? How many folks here participated in some way against the fight on the Keystone XL pipeline? Raise your hands. Okay. So we've had, obviously, a victory in the last 12 months against Keystone, where the pipeline that would take some of the dirtiest oil in the country from the tar sands all the way down to the Gulf wasn't built. Well, in that same time period, over the last few months, activists on the left and on the right came together to stop the Palmetto pipeline in Georgia, which would have taken natural gas and transported it to a whole new fleet of natural gas plants. We've defeated the Alberta Clipper pipeline to the north of here and a little bit to the west, in the upper Midwest. We defeated the Constitution pipeline in New York State. We defeated a crude by rail proposal last week in Benicia, California. We defeated another crude by rail proposal in San Luis Obispo in the southern part of California 3 days ago. We defeated another crude by rail terminal proposed in Anacortes, Washington yesterday. So all of this work, all of this progress gives the Sierra Club enough confidence that what we are now advocating for is no new fossil fuel infrastructure anywhere in the country. No coal, no gas, no oil, and no bailouts for nuclear power. And we've got the movement now, collectively, that gives us the power to achieve those goals, gives us the chance at achieving those goals. So as you heard Governor Bill Ritter talking earlier, a funny thing happened on the way to the future, which is that in that time period, as we have begun to take coal offline, and as the cumulative work by activists and scientists and clean energy executives has helped clean energy to grow, and as state after state after state has developed renewable portfolio standards, building the market for clean energy has become cheaper than dirty fuels. New solar and new wind is now cheaper than new coal in almost every part of the country. New solar is now cheaper than a peaker natural gas plant in all 50 states, all across the country. So what that means, if you're an industry regulator, the only proposals coming your way are solar and wind and gas. New coal is done. And in every state, The most affordable option is clean energy. That is an historic and profound shift that we're never going to go back from. It's irreversible. It's irreversible. We're getting economies of scale for solar and wind that will allow for continuing, won't go on forever, but it will allow for, over the next several years, continuing drops in prices of solar and wind, battery technologies you heard earlier, energy storage capabilities, demand response technologies. So I wanted to just lay that out, my perspective, where the economics are, as a background to talk about, from that framework, how do we get beyond this dynamic that we have right now, where there's the left and the right on climate change, on energy issues, on the environment generally. And so have four rules, principles, guiding points, comments. Let's just kind of tone down the rhetoric a little bit. 4 ideas for how we can navigate through this world. First one is to keep winning. Come from a position of strength. Because in a lot of places where we are replacing coal with clean energy, or not building out gas and going instead to clean energy, this is happening in Republican districts. Some of the deepest, most conservative districts in the country. In Oklahoma, Oklahoma Gas and Electric had a proposal several years ago to build massive new coal-fired power plants. Sierra Club, Earth Justice, and other groups litigated against that, organized against those proposals, lobbied against those proposals, and we won. And as part of our settlement, as part of the litigation, we secured significant investments in wind technology. New wind. Several hundred megawatts, more than close to a gigawatt of new wind was secured as part of these negotiations. 1,000 megawatts. And initially, the utility agreed not to build the coal plants, and they met that commitment, but then they didn't follow up on the wind investments. So we went back and threatened a second round of litigation. And then Oklahoma Gas and Electric put out a request for proposals and found that new wind in Oklahoma was not only coming in cheaper than the new coal proposals from several years previous, but was coming in cheaper than new gas as well. So they had an opportunity to promote local jobs, in-state jobs, and do it in a way that would save ratepayers money. In Nebraska, also a state that is rarely accused of being a communist, socialist, environmental tree hugger breeding ground, the Omaha Power District has moved, by the end of next year, again, they have retired their coal plants, not built out new coal, and will move to 40% of its power coming from wind by the end of 2017. You heard Bill earlier talking about what's happening in Iowa. In Iowa, Mid-American, about 10 years ago, proposed to build new coal and new nuclear plants. The coal plants were never built, the nuclear plants were jettisoned, and now Mid-American, which is owned by Warren Buffett in Iowa, after this new wind installation is complete, they'll be producing 85% of their power for all their customers across the state. 85%. Okay? You have, it's the mayor of Lancaster, California, has committed to go to 100% clean energy. Rex Paris is his name. He's a Republican. You have the mayor of Georgetown, Texas, who has committed for his city to go to 100% clean energy. Dale Ross. He's a Republican. You have the mayor of San Diego, the 8th largest city in the United States, who has voted, the city council and the mayor voted unanimously to go to 100% clean energy. Kevin Faulconer is also a Republican. In Kansas, you have a state that has doubled its wind production 4 times in the last 10 years. And the governor of Kansas, Sam Brownback, has committed to get the state to 50% clean energy within the next couple years. Sam Brownback is also a Republican. So when I talk about our need, the best way to build the biggest coalition is to keep winning, that's what I mean. Is that regardless of what your core values are, you may approach climate change because you feel that we have a moral obligation to protect species around the world who don't have a voice, who don't have a seat in Congress or a seat at the UN General Assembly. And you may feel that that's the most compelling reason why we need to get involved. You may have served in the military, and you saw how our dependence on dirty fuels cost money, but also cost lives. And you want to see both the US military and the US government and other governments get off of fossil fuels. You may be a business owner who simply is making decisions on an economic basis. And for those reasons, you want to move away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy. The first rule is to keep winning and to show how when we transition away from fossil fuels towards clean energy, it helps to solve a lot of other problems at the same time. Makes us more competitive as a country compared to other countries. We are able to save money, reduce air pollution, reduce water pollution, help to meet this global challenge that we have. So part of our challenge is to show how when we make these transitions, the successes are enduring. Second rule, so if the first rule is to keep winning, second rule, don't be suckers. Don't be suckers. We got to be honest with each other and around the country about the real nature and the level of disagreement on climate change. Because there's barely any disagreement anymore. I mean that. There's barely any disagreement. If you look at what Tony Lazarowicz is doing, if you look at the Pew Research Project, if you look at almost every poll that is coming out and has been coming out for the last couple years, it is clear that there is a supermajority, literally a supermajority of the American public who believes that climate change is real and that humans are the cause and that government and leaders in the private sector need to do more about that. We are seeing hundreds of business leaders. We are seeing leading Republicans at the local, municipal, state level stepping forward. We're seeing a majority in the Republican Party on the need to take action on climate change, that climate change is real, that human beings are the cause, and we need to show greater leadership on this. So it is true, if you were to watch the debates, or if you were to watch the debate, particularly coming out of the Beltway, or if you were to read most of the coverage on climate change, it is true that federally, the leadership within both parties are diametrically opposed on climate change. But that is a facade that is wafer thin. Wafer thin. There is no real, substantive, and significant disagreement in this country on the need to take action on climate change. So don't let people fool the American public to say that the entire American public is divided. Of course, there are people in this country who think that climate change doesn't exist. And of course, you'll be able to find people in the Republican Party who don't want to take action. Of course, it's not limited to Mitch McConnell, or Paul Ryan, or Donald Trump. It is concentrated. See? Curse of Donald Trump. I want to be really accurate on this. Of course, there are people. We're in a country of 300 million people. So you will find people in every county, in every congressional district, in every Democrat or Republican office somewhere who will say that climate change doesn't exist or we don't need to do anything about it. What I'm saying is don't feed into this idea that America is divided, because we're not. Polls don't support that. The policies that we're starting to see don't really support that either. Governor Ritter, when he was talking earlier, I thought he was very clear in saying how there is a divide between the political debate that we see and governors across the West or other elected officials across the country who say that they won't support the Clean Power Plan. There's a difference between what is said in front of reporters or on TV or when conversations are live from what is said behind closed doors, where many people are moving forward. So it's important that we don't feed into that. Rule 3, idea 3, is we have to get active, right? So George Foreman, Tom Steyer is going to talk later tonight. And one of the things that Tom talks about often is he quotes George Foreman. And he says, George Foreman would say, everybody has a strategy until I punch him in the nose. And Tom puts this in the political context to say that sometimes, a lot of times, political compromise is an art and it's a science. And you really do have to listen deeply, as we heard in the last session, about the true values and the true interests. And sometimes you have to simply win politically and vote people out of office who either don't have the political courage that's needed or aren't showing the political courage that's needed. I have 100% confidence that the politics on climate will shift like that. I have no doubt about it. The open question is when that will happen. It'll happen in an election, because you will see Republicans at the national level sometime who will step forward, and they will be welcomed with a lot of hostility and open arms by a majority of the public. This is a winning issue. It's political gold. Until that happens, those of us who care about climate change, who believe in clean energy, who believe that this is the most important challenge of our time, we have to organize and vote and phone bank and knock on doors and donate, and to do it as much as you possibly can in the next couple weeks and in the next couple years. This mirage has to be punctured. This idea that there's a divide and this reality where there are a few people who are manufacturing confusion about climate change or manufacturing this division on climate change have to be voted out of office, and their allies also have to be voted out of office. And that's up to us. Fourth thing is, for other conservatives, the majority of conservatives, the majority of people in the Republican Party, we have to welcome them. This is the obvious point. Many people have made this point. But if progressives, if environmentalists or progressives are the only ones who are putting forward ideas on climate change, we're in trouble. I mean, I agree with myself pretty often. But I don't want only the left to put forward solutions. If there's no competition, we're not going to get the best of what our country has to offer in any jurisdiction, on any city council, in any state legislative body. So it's up to us to help to show support for those conservatives who are stepping out, and to listen deeply to what their values are, what their concerns are, and to figure out a way to get through. Last thing I want to say is probably the most important. And this really does speak to getting out of this left-right piece. And it's something that I don't think we talk about enough. But it's the fact that there's a whole world out there. This morning, we had Antonio Guterres, who is now nominated to be the next Secretary General of the United Nations. There was a question earlier about refugees. Guterres served as the UN High Commission on Human Rights, High Commission on Refugees. And if you look at how he has talked about this intersection, the challenge for refugees, the refugee crisis that we face around the world, and the connections to climate change, he's one of the most eloquent speakers. And if we don't see that intersection and that connection, we're not going to be developing solutions that work for everybody. In Haiti, we have a couple hundred people who have died in the last couple days. One of the most beautiful, culturally rich, and poor nations in the world. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a couple months ago, we had one of the most severe storms ever seen in the United States, as you all know. Livingston, Louisiana, just outside of Baton Rouge, got 25.5 inches of rain in 4 days. It's more than we get on a good year in California all year long. 1 billion gallons of rainwater fell on the town of Livingston in 4 days, 1 billion gallons. If you look at the 57 towns around Livingston, the amount of water that fell, which obviously caused the floods that we saw, was as deep as the White House is high in 4 days. I bring that up to say that 86% of the houses in Livingston were flooded. 22% of them had flood insurance. Most of the people couldn't afford it. So what we need, clearly, if you were there listening to Mark Campanale or Bill McKibben last night, or Mindy Luber this morning, and if you accept the basic science that we can't burn the coal and oil and gas that's already been identified, that we need to recruit trillions of dollars in new capital, it's clear that to meet the demands of science, we have to move to 100% clean energy to have a shot at fighting climate change. To do that, we will need trillions of dollars of new investment. If we're going to do that, we need solutions that work for everybody. And that, having all of us develop solutions that genuinely work for everyone, I think is our biggest challenge. I wasn't there, I haven't been to every session so far. But has there been a mention of Black Lives Matter yet at this conference? Has? By Nikki? By you? Thanks, Hunter. Good. Doesn't come up in most climate change conferences that I go to. And if we think that we can build a movement that works for everybody without confronting racial injustice in this country, we won't build the movement that we need to advocate for the solutions that we need. I was glad that the question on refugees and immigrant rights came up. And Bill, I appreciated your remarks earlier. There are at least 11.5 million people who lack documentation, who are living in the shadows, as Governor Ritter was saying earlier. What that means is that they don't have the tools of democracy to fight for their rights. That's what living in the shadows means. It means that they have a chance of being deported. It means that there's a good chance that their families will be divided. It means that they're living in fear of those things all the time. And underlying all of that is that even on good days, even if there's a feeling of security, they don't have the ability to use democracy to fight for clean air, to fight for clean water, to fight for racial justice, to organize on behalf of their families and their communities and all of us. And so part of the challenge of the climate movement needs to be to figure out where we stand on racial justice. Do we take a stand on racial justice? I believe we have to. Where do we stand on immigrant rights? Do we take a stand for immigrant rights? I believe that we have to. Do our solutions really work for coal miners? Do we embrace justice and equity, as we've heard a couple times today, at our core? Are we putting our energy, when we think about transitioning off of oil towards electric vehicles, are we putting our institutional, our creative, our individual muscle and passion towards making sure that the people who are the most vulnerable in this country can get into that clean energy economy. They've got a job in the clean energy economy. They have access to clean energy. Are we advocating for policies at the local and state and federal level that will build coalitions enough that are big enough, diverse enough, and enduring to make a transition all the way off of fossil fuels? There are an enormous amount of clean energy jobs being created in this country. Are they good jobs? Are they great jobs? Are they family-sustaining jobs? Will they work for communities in a way that's better than fossil fuels? These are the questions that I think we have to answer. We have gotten to the point over the last couple decades where our solutions, our strategies, I think have been wildly effective. We are not yet at the point where we're creating an ecological U-turn that is catching up with climate science, but we are building the movement and the momentum where I think that we can do that. We have been able to start to transition away from coal and gas and nuclear power off the internal combustion engine. A diesel bus is cheaper, or excuse me, a clean energy bus is cheaper. A bus that runs on batteries is cheaper than diesel buses all across the country. All of this is a result of multiple factors coming in. Great innovation in the clean tech space, great advocacy for decades. We have now reached this point where clean energy can compete with fossil fuels almost everywhere in the country and almost everywhere around the world. And those trends will strengthen over time. Now it's time for the next phase of our work to reimagine what a victory looks like and to make sure that our ideas, our vision, our policies, our strategies, who we bring with us to the table, who negotiates our demands, has to be inclusive of everybody. Gandhi said that the difference between what we do and what we're capable of doing would suffice to solve most of the world's problems. And I believe that together we can close that gap. Thank you. All right, so now we come for questions, comments, criticisms, ideas, suggestions. So I think we have a few folks who are holding microphones, so if you have a question or comment, please raise your hand all the way in the back there with the tie. Sir? That's you. Trammell Crow.
Trammell Crow
How you doing?
from Earth Day, Texas. You had referred to this Republican understanding of climate change, and I heard this morning that there is a new study that says something like 23% of all Republicans believe in climate change. I thought it was much higher like you do. Do you know about this report?
I'm not sure. I know of reports, I'm happy to share you many of them, that show that there's a majority of Republicans who believe in climate change, that we need to do more. There's another one that came out earlier this week, one that came out at the end of last week about young Republicans. I'm not aware of something that shows numbers that low or anything close to it. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Also, same side. There's a microphone.
Like you, years ago, I used to do some volunteering with Greenpeace whenever the Moby Dick or the Beluga or the the old Terrapin would come into the area. I used to handle press for them. This is back in the early 80s. I mean, sorry, the late 80s, early 90s. But I started to digress from Greenpeace when they got anti-nuclear big time. After the 1991 meeting in Washington and everything, and I was with the study group. We were trying to refine the arguments and everything to really firm up the anti-nuclear argument, and by studying the industry, I started to question it and question the assumptions that why I was against it and everything. And then it was like it took me about 10 or 15 years of just reading and reading and reading. I'm at the point now, I'm looking at Canada where they are, right now it's about 67% nuclear power, and and that varies. I mean, they have their hydro about 22%. It varies. I've got an app if anybody wants to. The question, why I question the Sierra Club in their anti-nuclear position, because when you look at France, it's 80% nuclear, and many other countries. And if we're going to power electric vehicles and electric cars and also get rid of gas, which in the north we use this for heat, and as well as process heat, we're going to have to use nuclear reactors.
Okay, so well, first let me just offer support for your break from any institution. I think it takes guts and courage to have one mindset and then to diverge, even if I don't agree with where you've gone. And I also want to say that this transition is going to be difficult, clearly. The transition that we are proposing at the Sierra Club, we have no illusions that it will be simple. The movement from off of every coal plant and every gas plant and phasing out nuclear power towards a combination of solar and wind and efficiency and demand response is difficult to do. And then when you add on the challenges for transportation, as you did, and home heating, keeping our factories running, that is also difficult. We believe that the suite of clean energy solutions that I've talked about, energy efficiency among them, is a better option for our country, better than nuclear power as well as fossil fuels, in part because it'll employ more people, in part because it'll come online more quickly, in part because it doesn't create, or it creates much less other environmental problems, but because it's cheaper. There is not even a proposal right now in this country to mimic where France is, or to try to copy what other countries have done in terms of being reliant on nuclear power. And the reason for that is that nuclear power is the most expensive form of energy right now, by far. It's not even close. You can't find, I challenge you, you're shaking your head, but I challenge you to find a nuclear power plant proposal that isn't subsidized by billions of dollars, billions of dollars. You may argue that solar and wind have subsidies as well, far smaller than what's being afforded to nuclear power. So you can look at any single place where new nuclear is being proposed, and you will find that clean energy, solar and wind, will come online more quickly, more cheaply, and it'll create more jobs than nuclear power will. So that's why we're opposed to nukes as a real and viable option for our country's energy future. Take a question from over there.
Thank you. As you know, in the Bay Area, all the discussion is about autonomous driving, right?
Yeah.
You see the cars driving around Mountain View from Google, Uber, Lyft, the big three automakers are rushing toward autonomous driving, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you or the Sierra Club, how you are handling this and hopefully facilitating a transition to that technology being as green as possible. And you were just speaking of displacement. Given how many people are projected to be displaced by autonomous driving, how that massive upheaval might be managed as well. Thank you.
Sure, thanks for the question. My short and most honest answer is we don't have it figured out yet. Clearly it's a trend, and it also is right on the knife's edge. There are some compelling studies that show how autonomous vehicles could be effective at certainly reducing vehicle ownership, reducing the amount of land and physical space that's devoted to the automobile, and to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There are also studies that show that if policies go the wrong way, that it could help to stall some of the progress that we're making towards reducing our dependence on fossil fuels in the transportation sector and increase gridlock and decrease the quality of life. So we we're studying that right now to figure out how we might be able to engage and do so in a way that can help try to achieve more positive outcomes. And then as far as what you're saying in terms of displacement of workers, that's a real concern that certainly isn't limited to autonomous vehicles, as you know, isn't limited to the transportation sector, but it's something that our whole country is wrestling with. We are a little bit a part of the conversation about the future of work in this country and how making a transition towards a clean energy society can help to ease a fairly bumpy road that we're already facing and will continue to face over the next couple decades. So I want to be really clear, we don't have that figured out, even from our own perspective yet. We're trying to figure out what's the best way for us to, and what's the right way, where's the right place to take a stand and the best way to engage. Appreciate the question, though. Yes?
Hello. Is this on? What is the Sierra Club's position on zero waste initiatives, including food waste, landfills being a great contributor to greenhouse gas or the methane, plastic pollution? And I was a little disappointed that the New York City Sierra Club chapter endorsed for a state senate candidate a gentleman who had been city council member, but after he left, became a lobbyist for the styrofoam industry and was instrumental in getting the New York City ban that Bloomberg had pushed through on styrofoam, got it overturned, and for whatever reason, the local Sierra Club endorsed him over some of the other candidates. So I was pretty perturbed by that, being a member, but not on the board.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that endorsement. We endorse thousands of candidates up and down, and that's a local jurisdiction matter, so sorry I can't offer anything on that. We have been very involved in zero waste initiatives, and as part of, in some cases, fighting garbage incinerators, because we don't think that that's a good proposal and increases the health burden faced by local communities. And in places like California, there are, in other states, there are some really good models being established of municipal zero waste systems that, again, employ more people, reduce the amount of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions that come from garbage collection, and help to discourage the manufacturing and production of more toxic materials. In terms of food waste, we have not, the Sierra Club has done some work on food production issues, CAFOs, for a couple decades now. But we're realizing that nationally and globally, we are, as a society, likely to go over the 1.5 degrees Celsius. Like, there's a decent chance we're going to go over 2 degrees Celsius. And there is an urgent need domestically and around the world to help put more muscle and energy and thought into ways in which we can begin to take carbon out of the atmosphere, particularly biologically, which is a long way of saying that we're looking much more closely at the food issue, food production, transportation, consumption, zero waste, to figure out, in a similar ways to the last question, how we can engage and how we can be helpful to people who've been working on this for a long time. So if you have ideas, I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards. Other comments? Yeah? There's a microphone here.
Hi, Amanda Hanley.
Hi.
We've been hearing today how the Paris Agreement sent important market signals, and then meanwhile we have these trade agreements, TPP and others.
Yeah.
I've heard that there's going to be a big push to get this passed in the lame duck session. What is the Sierra Club doing among the other all green groups to stop that?
Plenty. We've been working on this for years on TPP, and I feel proud of the Sierra Club's role on this. So take a step back. So we are in a situation right now domestically, and really all around the world, in most governments around the world, where there are instances where at every level of government there may be a really strong climate policy, and then you have energy policy that can undermine that, or trade policy that can undermine that. And what we really need is much more cohesive, comprehensive strategies being embraced by every level of government. In the Obama administration, one can point to the successes of the administration through the EPA, through the Department of Energy, through the Department of the Interior, at beginning to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and then point to the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, which has helped to put forward TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which undermines our climate goals. And so the Sierra Club has been fighting on this hard. We have been, for years, working with members of Congress to help move them from a position of supporting TPP to opposition. We are holding rallies and demonstrations, doing tons of lobbying. I personally have been on the Hill a lot of times, making calls to legislators, either to support our champions who are firmly opposed to TPP, to move those who are on the fence and those who are supportive of TPP, to mess with their minds a little bit and tell them that the vote is happening on a Saturday or something like that. That was not true. So we've been working on this for a really long time. There will be a push by the administration to try to get TPP in the lame duck administration. The president has signaled that. He has some support among Democrats, probably more support among Republicans. I think politically it's hard to see how TPP gets passed, but it will be a fight. I think the next big fight is to make sure that the next administration has a much smarter trade policy. And I think our challenge, once again, is not just to fight trade deals. Right? I don't want to be part of a movement that simply works to stop coal plants or to stop pipelines or to stop bad trade deals. We are powerful as a movement and as a country. And so I would rather see fossil fuel industry fighting our trade deals rather than us fighting trade deals that we don't want. So our biggest challenge in the next year is to develop a trade deal, trade agreements that we support. Why should we not have a trade agreement that eliminates all fossil fuel subsidies? There's no reason why we can't do that. Why can't we have a trade agreement that locks in a transition towards clean energy? We should have a trade agreement that enhances human rights in an enforceable way, and that enhances labor rights in an enforceable way, which is not what we've had in past trade agreements. So we've done a lot of work on this, and it will continue to be a priority. Dan is just here, which is my signal to say that there's one more question. And sir, you had hand raised for the longest time.
I might be able to say this. What is Sierra's thinking on the export of excess coal and gas that's evolved?
We think that all of the excess coal and gas should be stored safely and snugly underground. And we are going to be proposing a set of new national parks underground because we don't think it's worth it to extract it, to have it be burned in the United States or anywhere. Thanks, everybody, for coming out, and thanks for being part of the conference.
Well done, sir.
Yeah.
So, were you serious, Michael? National parks underground? You did? Because we're doing it underwater, so why not? He said he just made that up, but I think it might be good. Keep winning. Don't be suckers. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, and get lots of ideas from everywhere. To summarize, so next up, we have Dr. Eve Sandberg is going to introduce our next speaker. Eve Sandberg is a professor here at Oberlin since 1990. She teaches international politics, foreign policy, the role of women in politics, and she has several times been recognized by the Oberlin community for her fabulous and impressive teaching. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Dr. Eve Sandberg, please.
Well, first, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. First, let me say thank you to David Orr, Dan Northrop for allowing me to participate today and for bringing together all of this wonderful creative talent to focus on such critical issues that we're facing. Today, I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is Dr. Juliet Schor, but after Dr. Schor speaks, we have a commenter, Michelle Long. So I just want to say a few words about Michelle so you'll understand who she is and where she's coming from when she comes forward. Michelle Long is the founding executive director of BALLE, Be a Localist. BALLE was founded in 2001. It's in Bellington, Washington. The organization's purpose, and I'm taking this from their website now, is to nurture and curate the emergence of a new economy, one that will gradually displace our destructive and failing economy with a system that supports health, prosperity, and happiness for all people and regenerates vital ecosystems. BALLE is a growing network of tens of thousands of community business people, entrepreneurs, local inventors, and foundations. And Michelle Long, who will be commenting, is also an advisor to the Schumacher Center for New Economics. She was named as one of the West Coast top 5 leading ladies of sustainability. And Michelle Long's work, her own work, reminds us that for sustainability problems that we confront, there will be no top-down solutions, that ownership matters, that strengthening local businesses matter, and that creating local business networks matter in the community approaches to creating a new eco-economy. So she will be the commentator after Dr. Juliet Schor speaks. And I just want to say one thing to Dr. Schor and to you. You're going to hear me, when I introduce her, you'll see that I'm a great fan of Dr. Schor. But most recently, she wrote something that concerned me a little bit. I think she's back there listening. Or shall I say more accurately, she tweeted last night about being in Oberlin, and I believe her tweet was, "Go Red Sox." So I've dusted off a cap to give her as a present from Oberlin and from Ohio. and so we can, the divides that we're trying to move beyond are not just political, they're sports as well. So welcome to Ohio. But let me be a little bit serious here, and let me tell you a little something about Professor Juliet Schor. I'm sure she's familiar to many of us as an academic activist. She graduated from Wesleyan College and went on to complete a PhD in economics at the University of Massachusetts. Dr. Schor taught and worked at Harvard University for 17 years in varying capacities, including assistant and associate professor of economics, director of studies for women's studies, and the professor of women, gender, and sexuality. Dr. Schor also worked at the United Nations as a research advisor on the project of global macro policy in the United Nations World Institute for Development Economics Research. She worked as a professor of economics at the University of Tilburg and at Yale University School of Environment and Forestry. Currently, Dr. Schor is a professor of sociology at Boston College, and she also currently is one of 10 principal investigators for the MacArthur Foundation's major initiative, Connected Learning Research Networks, which is dedicated to reimagining learning for the 21st century. Schor's work on this project analyzes the intersections and contexts of home, school, and popular cultures. Dr. Schor is also the co-founder of the Center for the New American Dream, promoting sustainability. She served on its board for over 15 years. She also serves as vice chair on the board for a Better Future Project, a nationally recognized climate activist organization. Now, Dr. Schor has a 50-page plus CV with many honors and awards for her publications, so I will highlight only a few. She was selected as a distinguished visiting professor at the Aycliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. She was the Herbert Spencer Lecturer at Oxford College. Dr. Schor was selected as a research fellow at the Brookings Institution. She was selected as a fellow at the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trust, the V.K. Rasmussen Foundation, the Johnson Foundation, the Compton Foundation, the Garfield Foundation, and many, many more have recognized Dr. Schor with awards and funding. Dr. Schor has also solo authored and co-edited numerous books, several of which have been translated into multiple languages. Her books include Toward a Plenitude Economy, Sustainable Lifestyles in the Quest for Plenitude, Case Studies from the New Economy, which she co-edited with Craig Thomas, Yale University Press, Building a Sustainable and Desirable Economy in Society and Nature, Plenitude, the new economics of true wealth, Born to Buy, the commercialized child and the new consumer culture, Sustainable Planet, Solutions for the 21st Century, which he co-edited, The Consumer Society, which he co-edited, Do Americans Shop Too Much, The Overspent American, The Overworked American, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure, which I'm sure many have read, Capital, the State, and Labor, which many have read, you may have read the others too, but these were really major, really changed the national conversation. Financial Openness and the National Political Autonomy, not national policy autonomy, The Golden Age of Capitalism, Reinterpreting the Post-War Experience. Dr. Schor has published about 40 pages to cite our journal and popular articles, and I will not select from those. You get the idea that she is an independent thinker. She is prolific. What is important to us today, however, is that Professor Schor's work has contributed to our national conversations on what she has called the work and spend cycle to alter our understandings of production and consumption. She has investigated the political landscapes that we face and analyzed new patterns of time use, our new and emerging shared platforms of consumption. Dr. Schor continues to critique both free market and Keynesian economic paradigms, and she continues to ask the questions of how we might construct alternative economic structures that are sustainable for our communities and our planet. I know we'll all benefit from her insights today, and please help me welcome Dr. Juliet Schor. And I'll move over.
Thank you so much. That was just a really lovely introduction. So I am going to talk today about an issue that I think has been not on the table nearly enough as we think about climate, but it's one that could be really important in bringing together some of the kinds of coalitions that Mike was just talking about and the forward movement that we've all been thinking about for sort of creating a new next economy over the last 2 days. Now, it's been nearly a decade since the US economy crashed. At that time, the presidency was in Republican hands, and neoliberal policies of the sort that the Trump campaign is touting, tax cutting, deregulation, labor bashing, i.e. trickle-down policies, were in full force. The economy was in free fall and the pain was spreading. By the fall of 2009, the recession was at its deepest, just as the world was coming together for the climate talks in Copenhagen. Dubbed Hopenhagen, there was a huge push by scientists in the months leading up to the talks to raise awareness of how dire the situation had become, that the data were getting worse and worse, and how crucial it was to reach a real solution. As we all know, the meeting failed spectacularly, and it would take another 6 years until Paris and COP21 to get an international agreement, and a non-binding one at that. But thinking back to the situation in 2009, one thing is clear, that economic and climate goals were pitted against each other. Macroeconomists, politicians, indeed almost everyone saw economic growth, that is, expanding the size of the economy, as the solution to the economic situation. Indeed, growth is so ingrained in our national consciousness that it's common sense. Of course we need to grow. How else can we get jobs? But while it may have felt like common sense, and I think it still does, in some ways there is nothing sensical about it. In fact, the conversation in 2009 was akin to driving in a car that was approaching the climate cliff, with economists in the back seat urging policymakers to put the pedal to the metal, giving advice on how to get to the edge of the cliff even faster. Now, of course, the growth imperative won out. Climate legislation was pushed off the table in the wake of the pain. In the US and Europe, the crash did bring a burst of short attention to climate via stimulus funds for renewable energy and energy efficiency, But that money dissipated fairly quickly, and there have been really interesting studies about this. On balance, the impact of the recession on climate progress was quite negative. Public opinion shifted away from climate protection toward jobs. Of course, it shifted back now. And another crucial 5 years were squandered. While U.S. emissions fell during the recession as a result of the stagnation of the economy, falling in 4 of the 5 years from 2008 to 2012, they rose in 2013 and 14 as growth accelerated. More generally, the highly touted so-called decoupling of growth from emissions, with decoupling mean that growth and emissions no longer move together, has been slow to arrive. While the relationship has definitely weakened in the U.S. economy and elsewhere, expanding output still results in higher emissions. Today, the folly of a single-minded growth imperative is even more apparent, although the growth discourse continues to dominate. But instead of the growth imperative, more and more people are realizing we have a climate imperative. And instead of clinging to an outmoded model which pits climate progress against economic progress, we need policy changes that deliver large, indeed radical emissions reductions that also provide jobs, financial security, reductions in inequality, transformations in racial relations, and improvements in the quality of life. How can we do that? It's indisputable that the main thing we need to do to address climate is to stop using fossil fuels. We need to ramp up renewables as quickly as possible. We need to reduce energy demand via efficiency measures and innovation. We need a price on carbon. We've been talking about all these things, and we will continue to talk about them today and tomorrow. But I want to address another aspect of our response, which is changes in the economy itself, not just the energy system. These are changes that are also necessary to achieve the kind of climate mobilization that we need. Because a challenge as profound as climate change requires more than a technological transformation. It also requires a change in how we conduct our economic lives. So what kind of economic changes are necessary, and how might they actually be achievable? Today I'm just going to focus on one issue. Not because we don't need a longer list of reforms. And we've talked about finance. We just got into a conversation about trade. These are really important. But the topic I want to talk about is almost absent from the mainstream discussion on climate, and often from the more progressive discourse as well. It's important because of the size of its potential impact on emissions, as well as the fact that it's what we call a double dividend reform. It can achieve 2 goals at once: reducing emissions and addressing another economic problem. Indeed, it can be a triple dividend change. It's how people spend their time, and more specifically, hours of paid work. If we can significantly reduce average hours of work, emissions will decline, unemployment may also decline, and Mike just talked about it, Hunter mentioned it earlier, the future of work conversation, which I'll get to shortly, and quality of life will rise. Now, hours of work are key to a number of social and economic outcomes. The amount of time people devote to their paying jobs affects labor supply and therefore employment and unemployment. So it's a key factor in how labor markets operate. It affects how much money people have to spend, and it has social impacts on family and community life, stress levels, physical and mental health, political participation, and quality of life. American workers, once we exclude involuntarily unemployed and underemployed, and we have a lot of those at the moment, but American workers have especially long hours of work. In 2016, the average US worker put in more than a week more than the average Italian, 2 weeks more than the average Brit, 300 more hours than the average French man or woman, 350 more than the average Dutch, and a really astounding 400 more hours per year, or 10 additional weeks of work than the average German. And of course, the average German, as you know, is employed in the most successful economy in Europe. A growing number of Swedish employers, after a period in which Sweden decided to go in the other direction and raise hours, are moving back towards shorter hours, and there are more and more employers moving to 6-hour days with 8-hour pay and getting productivity increases to pay for those. The United States has not always been the world's workaholic nation. In the US, in the early 20th century, we were the leader in working hours reductions. After the Second World War, our annual hours were far below other wealthy nations. So if people tell you we can't reduce hours here because it's something deep in our culture, you can respond with our history. But in the late 1960s and 70s, the US began to diverge from other countries, and we increasingly became a nation of long hours jobs. That is for those who could get jobs. At the same time that hours were increasing, more and more people became under and unemployed, and we know, of course, that that has a class and racial dimension to it. That underemployment and unemployment is very disproportionately skewed. An economy of long-hour jobs produces fewer jobs, so what results is a shrinking majority of overworked employees and a growing minority who can't get enough work. And this contributes also to growing income inequality, a topic I'm going to come back to in a bit. Now, a big part of why this happens is that benefits are paid on a per-person basis, especially expensive health benefits, so employers want to minimize headcount. The structure of employment taxes also affects this. And it also is a part of the mindset of American employers. When the recession hit in 2008, US companies laid off far more workers than their European counterparts did. And in Europe, they softened the blow of the recession through what is called shorter work time policies or work sharing. In the US, nearly all of the decline in demand came in the form of unemployment rather than keeping your workforce on and reducing everybody's hours. Now, what does any of this have to do with climate? Well, there are two ways that time use, and particularly hours of paid work, affect emissions. The first is that households who are more time-stressed have to do things in more carbon-intensive ways. If you've ever tried to reduce your eco or carbon footprints, you'll know that doing things sustainably can take time. The most important example, of course, is transportation. The less time you have to get somewhere, the more fossil fuels you have to use. Think of the progression from walking to bicycling to public transport to private car to commercial airline to private jet. It's a very steep emission slope across those different modes of transport. But there are other ways in which time scarcity yields high eco footprints as well, whether we think about eating habits, growing vegetables is time intensive, purchasing new goods versus used, or repair. But the household effect, while it's there, is secondary in magnitude to the very large impact that occurs at the so-called macroeconomic or the system-wide scale. Economies that reduce working hours have much lower carbon emissions, holding the other factors which affect carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions constant. That's because shorter hours of work represent a trade-off. If people work more, they produce and therefore emit more. Back to that point I made earlier about growth, but now in this context just about production levels. Production entails emissions, consumption does as well. If we think about the big picture of taking leisure, what's happening in a society is that over time people are trading using productivity and trading money for time. It's a big part of why the short hour economies I mentioned earlier, the Netherlands, France, France has the nuclear issue, but aside from that, Germany, have been so much more successful at reducing emissions. It's not only energy sources, it's also how much demand for energy their economy is generating and the role that the labor market plays in driving demand for energy. When we trade income for time, we generate less demand for energy. and controlling energy demand must be a part of a successful climate response. Now, I've researched this effect for a number of years. Along with colleagues, we've looked at it cross-nationally, across wealthy countries. We've looked across all countries in the world. We've looked at how the relationship between working hours and emissions changes over time, and we find that it is getting stronger, that is, they are more connected to each other. We have a new paper that we're just writing up that models the effect of working hours on emissions across states in the US. And we find that states which have longer hours of average hours of work have higher emissions, even controlling for things like energy production in that state, income, sectoral composition, population, urbanization, and the environmental voting records of congressional representatives. It turns out that reducing hours of work is a potent climate policy. For every 1% reduction in working hours, emissions decline by about 2/3%. So that's a big effect. Now, I noted earlier that hours are a double dividend policy. When people work less, they have more time for family, friends, and community. They're less stressed out. Their health is better. They have higher quality of life. There are literatures on all of these impacts. But there's also another aspect to shorter hours, and that's, I said there's even a triple dividend aspect. It's easier to maintain enough jobs for everyone who wants one when hours are shorter. When hours are long, an employer needs to generate more revenue for each additional job. With shorter hours, it's easier to protect the jobs that currently exist, and it's easier to create new ones. After the 2009 recession, the difference in the amount of revenue a German employer had to generate for a new job versus an American employer was about 25%. So that's a very large difference. The employment impacts of shorter hours brings us to another concern, which I mentioned earlier: artificial intelligence and widespread, what we call labor displacing technological change. So that's any kind of machinery or other factors of production that make it possible to produce a certain amount of output with fewer hours of labor. In the last year or so, this conversation about the, quote, future of work has finally started to bubble up into the national consciousness. And it's interesting because one of the things the recession did was it completely took hours of work off the table. And that is something that had been happening for a long time. When I wrote The Overworked American in 1992, it was a really hot button issue, a lot of attention to it. 20 years later, it was erased from memory. Fascinating the way economists, including Keynesian economists like Joe Stiglitz and others, just completely forgot about the role of hours of work, including in the thinking of Keynes, who was really very important thinker about hours of work, particularly in the long term. Now, the message from the tech community on artificial intelligence and what the future of work holds is certainly overstated. In the sense that we have people from various places, MIT, probably most famously, predicting that artificial intelligence is going to massively eliminate the need for human labor. And not just for making cars and widgets with robots, but that we're going to have a computer named Watson diagnosing our medical condition instead of a doctor. That we're going to have software doing tax returns and legal documents, that we're going to have robots instead of live soldiers fighting wars, that we're going to have people like me, professors, being put out of work as students watch faculty online in MOOCs, massive open online courses, that computers will write newspaper articles, that they will do therapy, that they will clean our living rooms, that they will take care of the elderly. And of course, as you know, every single one of these things is already happening. But if the techies are overstating things a bit, and I think they are, the coming wave of artificial intelligence is real. It is going to have massive labor displacing impacts, and it requires fundamental rethinking and deep thinking about how we should respond. Do we just in this free market economy, let a growing number of people become unemployed without income and livelihood, dependent on our absolutely Dickensian welfare safety net? Or do we offer a basic income to all, as Silicon Valley tycoons who are foreseeing this world have increasingly begun to suggest? Do we reduce hours of work for all to share the work that does exist? Do we put in a combination of the above? Whatever path we prefer, and that's a conversation we have to have as a country, which we are facing, what we can't do is to try and grow our way out of what will surely be a shortage of jobs. We're a mature economy that won't be able to achieve a high enough growth rate, even if we wanted to. And I'll just put in a little aside here. It's very interesting that in the last year or two, a conversation about what economists call secular stagnation or long-term stagnation has finally made its way from the margins. I wrote in my Plenitude book, 2010, we're in for a long period of slow growth. Now that conversation has been taken up by people like Larry Summers and Robert J. Gordon. It's become a mainstream question. Are we in a long-term period of low growth? But so I don't think we could, even if we wanted to. But even if we could, trying to achieve a high growth economy is a disaster for the climate. More growth equals more emissions. That's a mantra we can't lose sight of. We have to find a way to equitably distribute work and money that serves everyone's needs and lets us meet radical emissions reductions. I don't think it's possible to do that without declines in average hours of work. So if we did want to get going down the path of reducing working hours, what's a feasible and fair way to proceed? There are quite a few options, and we're going to need a suite of them. There isn't one policy that does it. Workers in the labor market are in very different situations. Some have enough money and not enough time. Others lack time and money. But here are a few things we could do, and we need to do them. As I say, we need to do a number of things. One is to mandate paid vacations for all Americans. Right now, almost 25%, and of course those are the lowest paid, least well treated workers, don't get paid vacation at all. And a majority of people who do don't feel they can take it all. We could start with 2 weeks and gradually increase, as European countries have done. That would be a popular reform. Other policies include enforcing overtime laws and giving people the right to take compensated time off if they want it, and using the unemployment insurance to encourage work sharing, what I talked about earlier, instead of layoffs. This is legal in many states, over 20 now, but it's rarely used. There are also changes that target high earners, many of whom have to work long hours. We could make it a legal right to trade income for time. Millions of Americans want to work less, but their jobs aren't flexible. In the Netherlands, employees have the right to ask for and receive shorter hours in exchange for money, and they are not allowed to be penalized in terms of their career ladders if they do. We could give employees the right to go to a 4-day work week, 80% time, 80% pay. This would be a very popular reform for many higher paid employees. In surveys I've done on this, most recently in 2014, I generally find that about more than 50% of people who answer the surveys say they would like to take that option of that 80%. I don't think actually more than 50% would take it, but even if 20% took it, I think that's a more realistic number based on some other polling I've done, some other questions. That could make a significant difference. One benefit of that kind of reform is that it reduces the income of better paid employees. That both reduces inequality and it also shifts income away from the people with higher incomes who have higher carbon footprints. I mean, one of the things we haven't talked much about yet is the unequal distribution of carbon impacts. They very closely follow income and wealth distributions. But so shifting income from the top increases the carbon impact. And that brings me to another important double dividend reform that I don't have time to discuss fully, but is really important, and that is inequality reduction. In new work I've been doing with colleagues, we are analyzing the impact of concentrated income and concentrated wealth on emissions. And this really goes to something we've been sort of talking about, but not enough, I think, in the last 2 days, and that is the justice angle here, the idea of policies which are really bringing us together, reducing inequality, empowering people, and addressing climate. So we find that in high-income countries, the more concentrated income is, and also the more concentrated wealth is, and we have the first new study, hopefully coming out very soon, on wealth concentration and its impact on emissions. We find across countries, more income concentration, more wealth concentration equals higher emissions. We've also analyzed this effect at the state level, similar to what I talked about earlier for working hours. The more concentrated income is at the top, so a measure of the top 10, how much income the top 10% have in that state, the more emissions that state generates, holding constant all those other factors I mentioned earlier. So reducing inequality, like reducing hours of work, is a climate positive, important reform. Back to work time. The ideas I've mentioned are good and tested, these kinds of work time policies. They've been used elsewhere. They can be instituted at a state level and not just at the national level, while we still face that national federal gridlock, which Mike talked about earlier. So they have some possibilities for implementation in a few places, which then begin to model and build up toward national legislation. But even in the absence of government policy to reduce working hours, there are things that individuals and communities can do to work less and pollute less. And some of these policies, by the way, can also be instituted at municipal level. Government employees going on four-day work weeks and so forth. For those who can trade income for time, either within their current jobs, they can change jobs, people can forgo overtime, they can save and move out of the labor force, they can share jobs. Of course, this is not possible for many, but for those for whom it is a strategy that typically reduces emissions. A key dimension of my Plenitude model was to diversify sources of income to reduce dependence on one job, especially a long hours job, and therefore to allow people to make those kinds of changes. And the people who have done that, and there are a growing number of people around the country who are living these kind of more alternative, or what I call Plenitude lifestyles, they are involved in a wide array of creative ways to live their lives without being chained to a long-hour job. One strategy is to reduce the amount of money needed to reduce the amount of money you need to earn in the conventional labor market by doing things like self-provisioning, DIY, learning a new skill which you can then use to earn money. And typically those new skills are sort of green alternatives, low-impact things. I encountered quite a few people who quit conventional jobs to develop new careers, teaching or providing green goods and services, which help others live more sustainably, like people building low-impact housing, permaculture specialists, master gardeners, alternative energy providers, and so forth. These folks typically report high quality of life, even if they don't have high and growing incomes. In general, working less is possible if you reduce your consumption requirements. Take advantage of secondary goods markets to buy fewer new things. Join goods lending platforms or time banks. The options for living cheaper but richer consumer lives have expanded tremendously, even in the years since I wrote that book, which came out in 2010. And they open up an opportunity. If you need to buy less, you need to earn less. And of course, that's obvious. But what's worth mentioning is that more and more people are doing this, and as they do, it becomes far more normalized and therefore much easier to do. In some sense, the problem of ecological degradation and climate change can be understood as fundamentally a problem of time. This is a point that the great visionary Dana Meadows and I discussed a short while before her death. Humans have sped up the time scale on which they operate. Capitalism has done that, as its essential feature is speeding up the movement of money. But of course, the temporal rhythms of nature and the Earth's ecosystems have not changed. So we are operating on a time scale that is out of sync with that of the Earth. We are producing too much too quickly for ecosystems to cope with. And in the process, we are destroying the planet. So we need to decelerate in our production and by extension in our daily lives. As the movement to live sustainably spreads, it will and must be a movement to work less. That means it will also be a movement to slow down, to engage with each other more, to take time to enjoy life, to be active in community and with each other, to appreciate every day, and to experience the wonder that is our Earth. Thank you.
I do. You want my jacket? You said you record. No. Seriously, I'm hot. So the temperatures, we're having temperature fluctuations on stage. I'm noting that because of the reduced work week, we only have about 10 minutes left. So no, I'm kidding. That was a joke. We go to 4:15. I'm just advocating. I'm just trying to be the change we want to see in the world.
Working very hard. They probably need a break.
So, Michelle, you get to respond first,
Okay.
and you can respond with either your own thoughts or a question for our speaker. But what resonated with you? Let's start there.
Well, lots resonated, but I felt, in some ways, I guess I was sitting there thinking, how crazy is this? How crazy is even what you're talking about? You know, that we're actually talking about, should we work less and enjoy life more? And, well, if somebody makes something like a driverless car, when currently 1 in 4 men in this country drives for a living, should they get to keep all the money if other people have nothing? Was that a good idea? I mean, it's kind of crazy. Like, that's what I'm thinking. It's crazy. That's what I'm mainly thinking. I'm sad, and I think it's crazy. And I'm cold, and it's nice outside, and that's crazy. And, you know, why aren't you holding hands? You probably want to, and instead you're like, oops, sorry, I bumped into you. And, like, so many things are crazy, you know? That's the main thing I'm feeling.
Most afternoons like this for you?
You know what Prince said?
What?
Let's go crazy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we are going crazy. We've gone crazy.
Bit. Juliet, I wonder if you could unpack some of the basic premise. Why specifically? What is the causality between working less and reducing carbon footprints? Beyond just sort of, if I'm working 4 days, then I'm only driving to work back and forth to work 4 times. But what's the real?
Yeah, it has nothing to do with that. That's
okay, what is it?
Added.
What is it?
So, a given amount, I think it's easier to think about in a dynamic sense. In any year, there's a certain amount of productivity growth in the economy, meaning people can produce more with in fewer hours. And now we ask the question, how do we respond to that? We could keep people working as many hours as they were, which means we're going to increase our production, or we could say, let's just produce at the level we're at this year and give everybody those extra hours off. The big effect, the second one I talked about, we call it the scale effect, is because production entails emissions.
Okay.
Now, consumption does too, and they're not exactly the same. That gets a little more complicated, but that's the main impact that I'm talking about.
I'm trying to imagine like the talking heads on CNBC, like all 12 of them lined up saying, production this year is exactly what it was last year. Productivity is exactly the same. We're winning.
Well, let me tell you about a place I lived where that's what happened, okay? I lived in the Netherlands for 2 years in the 1990s. In the 1980s, there was, I don't know if many of you probably remember, between 1980 and 82 was a very severe worldwide downturn. Big unemployment here, created a lot of the rust in the Rust Belt, and Europe was hit very, very hard. The Dutch decided that they were going to respond by basically freezing real wages, which is the equivalent of freezing production. Let's not think about trade. Freeze real wages and reduce hours of work so they could get people back into jobs. So they did a number of things. All new government employees, and these were typically people coming out of college, so they weren't people who had big salaries to begin with. They were hired on 4-day schedules, so they got 80% of what the pay would have been, and they had 3-day work weeks. Eventually, the entire financial sector in the Netherlands went on to 80%, so that just Friday, they weren't working. And those shorter hours spread out all across the economy, and they had more and more free time, and their wages basically stayed the same for 15 years.
15.
For about 15 years. That's when they started to have, some tension because the countries around them were having bigger increases, increases in wages. So
well, 15 years after the early 80s would have been like the tech boom, the first tech boom or something like that. And
they had the highest productivity in Europe. They had basically no unemployment. They had a fantastically well-functioning economy. So you can do it. Countries have done it. We did it for many, many years. We didn't take all of our productivity growth in the form of shorter hours, but we took a good fraction of it. So we had, a lot less growth.
I feel like the way the U.S., and maybe you have some thoughts on this too, the way the U.S. tends to think about this is like during the last economic crisis, 8 or 9 years ago, people were getting furloughed, and that was just bad news. And the language, people were, they saw it as have just a negative impact on their lives, fewer hours, lower wages, and they were upset. And there wasn't this idea that, this is actually an advantage. I don't recall a single person, saying that this was
Are you
good.
talking about the 2009 crash?
Yeah.
Well, that was a more negative experience with furloughs than we have had previously. But part of the reason is that people have, we've had such a big growth in inequality. That makes it harder.
Right.
Because higher inequality tends to yield higher hours. So that is one reason. But there's a lot of experience with furloughs earlier on that was much more positive. And the other thing I'll say is, anything that you force people to do is hard. We've got a big reservoir of people who would like to make those trade-offs, and we have a labor market that doesn't allow them to do it. So before we start forcing people into furloughs, what about opening up the labor market to give people the option to trade income for time?
Michelle, you're an advocate for small businesses, and small businesses often have sometimes more flexibility in this area to work around the lives of the people who make up their labor force.
They have more, I don't know if they have more flexibility, but they tend to choose that more.
Right.
You hear much more often small businesses saying, we're all going to do a reduced work week rather than lay people off. Rather than, I don't know how many people saw McDonald's, for instance, a couple of years ago, there was that expose, or I don't even know, it was just like somebody who worked there shared what happened with a typical budgeting conversation with a McDonald's employee, where they do some counseling to ensure that you can make it on the wages that they provide, and they do the revenue line items and all the expense line items, and under expenses they don't have any line for healthcare expenses, and they don't have any line for childcare expenses, and they sort of leave out a bunch of expenses. And then under revenue, they have you working 40 hours at McDonald's and your second 40-hour work job. So they expect you to work 80 hours and to not be able to even afford childcare or healthcare. And that's what we have at large corporations we are then also supporting them with our public tax dollars in the form of food stamps and other benefits for their employees while they're a profitable company. And so that, to me, is another example of what's just crazy. You know, that's another example of what's just crazy. You named so many examples of how we could live more simply, which I'm a big fan of. Live more simply so others may simply live. There's enough for everybody's need, nobody's greed. And do more sort of bartering and skill swapping, and so many poor people are already doing that, as you know. So many poor people are already doing that. But we work with a group, for instance, called the Food Lab in Detroit, and in a community where literally dominant system disappeared, you know, automakers disappeared and Motown disappeared, and so many people that were there left. What would you do if everything collapsed? They started to grow food in empty lots, and then they started to process those foods. But it was so difficult because the economic development departments and the permitting departments, they'd all closed. When you call the police, nobody comes. And so you could call a guy if you get him on the phone about a permit for your food business, but his files were all at the office and he was working from home. And you couldn't get access to a commercial kitchen, although there was tons of it, it's just all boarded up. But I went and visited, and you're with people who are entrepreneurial and taking care of themselves, but they already are doing all this sort of efforts to try to skill share and be as efficient as possible. But there's great resilience in the human spirit. I mean, they were singing like rounds, like row your boat rounds. One group was saying, making the dough, making the dough. Another one was watching it rise, watching it rise. Another one's food lab holla, and they were doing this, and it was so good, you know, so that's happening. That sort of thing is happening all over the country. But we also have to, justice is love in action, you know, so we have to move resources, economic development dollars from subsidizing McDonald's to subsidizing what actually works to grow businesses for local, real people. And so that's, I think we have to change our mindsets, and we have to change actually where we put money right now.
Juliet, where does it, if something like this were to take hold, where would it begin? Would it begin with government employees, with the largest employees? Would it begin at Ohio State University? Or would it begin with, how would it start?
Well, it can start in different ways. I mean, it has started in certain, you can find certain areas of the country, Pacific Northwest, for example, where people have lower working hours and lead more of these kinds of lifestyles. Or, I mean, in my state, if you go out to the western part of the state where housing costs are lower, it's easier to do. But in the Netherlands, they started with government. We could do that. Universities are another excellent place to do it. Hospitals, I mean, sort of thinking about some of those anchor institutions that we heard about this morning. They are, I think they're good places. In my field, in academia, not many people who have full-time jobs are able to do that. The universities typically
you mean in the world of adjunct professors?
To trade income for time. So if you're full-time, if I said, you know, I'd rather go to three-quarter time or half-time, there's a little bit more flexibility for it now at end of career. There are some cases where two people are allowed to share jobs, but it's something you have to fight for. That should be something that universities should be open to and allow people to do just because they want to. I think the one thing you have to watch out for also, and I don't know how much the experience you referenced earlier is this, for salaried workers, if you go to 80%, you've got to make sure your workload doesn't stay at 100. So, I mean, that is a problem. Right. So you have to be able to have control over your workload so you actually really get the time off and don't just have a reduction in pay.
Right. Questions from the audience? Let's go there first. If we got, I'm sorry, I sprung that on our student volunteers. It will take just a moment to, so we're, okay, maybe we'll go over here first, and then you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm inspired by what I'm sort of thinking of as the potential of diversification that could come both from the individuals who are working fewer hours, therefore they're paying attention to other things that they might be paying attention to less so if they're working like me, a 60-hour work week, as well as the environments where there may be more diversification of thought in those working environments. So presuming that you're not just reducing hours, but you're also bringing in more people into those environments, I think there's a real domino effect that is inspiring to me. If I'm imagining that there's living wages and that, at home, people are still able to do what they need to do to meet their needs. And I'm just curious if you have run across any other research that supports both the diversification that can happen as a result of reducing hours, but also the impact of diversification in our environmental consciousness, our economic consciousness, and our social justice consciousness, and if there's a correlation there in your research at all. Thank you.
Should I?
Go ahead.
Yeah. I don't know of anyone who has looked at that question. And I think one of the things is that it's not obvious that just reducing hours and creating more employment opportunities through that would actually lead to diversification if you didn't have it before. I think you're probably going to have to take sort of affirmative measures if you really want to diversify a workforce on whatever dimension you're thinking of. And in answer to your second question, I don't know of any. It doesn't mean, I'm pretty sure there isn't any on work time. On all those other issues, I've never seen any.
Okay. We're going to go to John Peterson down here in the front, was the next one.
Hi.
It's on. It's on.
Yeah. I'm very excited about what you're saying. I frankly would love to work less hours. I think that the challenge from the perspective of my employer probably relates to two big issues, which I hope you can address. One is healthcare and the other is retirement. I feel like unless you have socialized healthcare, as they have in these European countries, if the employer's bearing, it's just a challenge. If you could just speak to that issue, because that seems to me to be a big challenge to doing what you're suggesting.
Yeah, it is, and I raised it. There are a couple of ways to go. And this is why, I think the Affordable Care Act is a step in the direction of trying to ease this. One thing just to note about the health insurance is that the tying of health insurance to employment was an accident in American history. It occurred because of wage and price controls during the Second World War, and there was a lot of pressure in the labor market at that time. Employers were having a hard time getting workers, of course, because of the war, and so they began offering health insurance as a way to skirt the wage and price controls. So bad thing, ultimately, which led to this then rigidity in the labor market. We could go to a more socialized system. We could go to, if you're wealthy enough, you can get prorated benefits. And then you would kick in a bit more. Of course, if you're taking less salary, you can't afford that unless you're really a higher income employee. So I used to work at Harvard for a long time. They gave full insurance to part-time workers. So wealthier employers can do it. In the tech sector, they could probably do it. I think it's harder when you get to places like, the sort of low road employers.
They do it at Starbucks.
They do it at Starbucks. Yeah, so some can do it. Retirement, yes. Basically same issue. The other thing I feel is that retirement is an area where sort of alternative thinking about how to create more security in retirement is really lagging behind what we've thought about in other ways, because we haven't established a sort of more collective security kind of alternatives to just people amassing money and going into the market to buy stuff. We've done a lot more for people at earlier stages, but I think, we need to start thinking about a much broader array of ways that we can basically support each other in retirement, whether it's time banking. That is one thing that there's a little bit on co-housing, just a lot of stuff that you can do so that you can have a good retirement with less cash savings.
It strikes me too, though, that given the ways in which our life expectancy has changed over the years, that at 65 years or 70 years or 72 years or whatever it is, it's not really, there's a resource that we're not taking advantage of, in that people can still, even at what would have been considered traditional retirement age, could still be contributing to workplaces if they don't, but it's a real opportunity to then go to that reduced work week if they wanted to. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, like, there's a real resource there that,
But here's the problem. If you think about one of the things that happened with the 2009 crash was in Europe especially, because they went for austerity and it just made things a lot worse there. So they started thinking much more about keeping people in the labor market for a longer period of time. We've got to remember the AI challenge that we're facing, which is it's in wealthy countries especially, it's going to get harder and harder to create enough jobs to keep people employed. So do we really want to be thinking about policies that keep people in the labor market longer? I think we want to be thinking about policies that move people out of the paid labor market, that give them, I mean, I didn't used to support it, but basic income plus shorter hours of work. I just don't think we're going to be able to avoid it. People can do a lot of great stuff outside of the paid labor market. We're going to need more and more people in the unpaid sector, which is a key dimension of well-being. The huge amount of unpaid labor in our society, whether it's in the household or in the community. I mean, as climate change creates more and more chaos, we're going to need more and more people buttressing not just the market economy.
Right, in the volunteer capacity. Okay. Who else? The red shirt?
I'm curious about your thoughts on the cultural differences that allow Europe, and most particularly Scandinavian countries, for example, there's a sort of undercurrent of Lagom principle that guides Scandinavian culture of you want to have enough to go around and you don't want to rise above, whereas and I'm no sociologist, but my understanding of American culture is more of a keeping up with the Joneses, and whereas in Norway, you would be embarrassed to have the big McMansion. Here, we kind of thrive on that. And how do you see that cultural difference playing into the acceptability of this? I mean, you suggested that most people suggest a willingness to take less pay and less time, but you also voiced doubts about whether that will actually happen if given the option. And how do you see the cultural differences playing to that?
Do you want to speak to that?
Sure, you should, because of but I would say some things in that there is, just generally worldwide right now, there is a collective loss of meaning for so many people right now, all over this planet. Apparently right now there are more deaths from suicide than there are from war put together on this planet right now. And what I do think is necessary is sort of the Einstein quote, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. We're at that kind of moment. And when we talk about retirement, people don't really want a big pile of money at the end. They want to make sure they're not in the streets. They want to make sure they have somebody taking care of them and sitting with them at the end of their lives. And my friend Leslie Christian, who's a wealth advisor, talks about that, how to build community rather than only wealth, and that she in fact helps people to build wealth based on how much money they start with. So if you come to her with $20,000, then she wants to help you build your family assets. But if you come with her with $20 million, she wants to help you move them away from yourself over the course of your life. And what I do think is, John Fullerton was sitting right there, he is. I saw one time on the cover of The Economist, there was Welcome to the Anthropocene was the title of it, and he wrote a response saying, well, there's only one thing that makes sense here. interdependence. We're all in this together, you know. This is it. Like, there just can't be like you over there trying to deal with climate change or cause it or stop it or, you know, this is one planet, it's all of us, we're in it together. That's the only thing. And I met the man who created the GNH framework in Bhutan, the gross national happiness, and he said that every era requires commensurate leadership capacities to meet that era, and the era that we're in now with the Anthropocene and inequality relates to the capacity of leaders to see and make decisions from the benefit of the whole, not just themselves, not just what benefits me versus you, but what benefits all of us, including me. And that culturally, collectively, worldwide, in Scandinavia or here, of people all over the entire planet, the Greater Good Science Center out of Berkeley has done research showing that all human beings feel well-being deeply when they feel connected to some inner reason for being here. Like, thank you, I get to be a human being. I have something to do on this earth. When they feel connected to each other, when they feel connected with almost a sense of awe of the larger natural world. Like, did that tomato plant just give me a tomato? How did it do that? Like that kind of awe when you feel that. And when you've been generous or compassionate, you feel good. So that kind of interdependence is our natural human state. It is our humanity. But we've, depending on the culture, we've moved away from it, different states, different places, but growing in every place, you know. It can be cultivated, however, and I think that you mentioned Dana Meadows. She wrote Limits of Growth, and she wrote that famous essay on the 12 levers of systems change. And her number one lever was the mindset out of which the system arises, because we then develop a system that meets that mindset. We develop institutions and policies that support that system. But what do we believe? Do we believe we're good? Do we believe we're in it together? Do we believe it's not okay for some people to have a lot and some people to have nothing? It depends on what we believe, because we'll build whatever we want based on that. So that's, for me, is the biggest thing. Like, step way back, cultivate our interdependence with each other, our own hearts. If you can't right now, if it seems crazy to you for somebody, if it seems crazy to you, the idea that somebody could just get to be without working really hard in a menial job all day, but still could have food and shelter, then you probably need to work on your heart. You know, that's a good thing to be cultivating within yourself. Anyway, just some thoughts.
Great. So I think what you say about Scandinavia is right, but I want to go back to that point I made about American culture and sort of the people say, no, we're just a workaholic culture, that this is somehow deeply ingrained here. I mean, there are aspects of that here, but there are also aspects of the other. We've talked about whether the way to make change is through sort of culture change or mindset change or policy, economics. You know, I come from social science. I think it's really important, I mean, this is my view, they are always in relationship to each other, so that culture change creates economic and political change, which in turn creates cultural. You'll never do it. That's what it means to be an interdependent system. It's not just one of those things that makes change. So it's not just, oh, we have to change our mindset. Because if we start to change the way we live and what we do, our mindset will change. That's one of the things we know from the time use research. That, and that's, you know, some of the more optimistic research about people who get a 4-day work week who then say, oh, I'd never go back, because then they think very differently about their lives. So I tend to be, you know, what we call in sociology a practice person who focuses on how people actually practicing different ways of being and living then in turn changes how they think about them. But all of these things are important. The policy, the key thing there between Scandinavia and the US now is the income distribution. And that's really central in why you have more of that hesitancy to show off there and more of a, you know, what I've called competitive consumption here.
We are at 4:15, so we're going to have to say thank you to both of you, and which I do, and we all do. Juliet, Schor, Michelle Long, thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, you're very welcome. So we have one more session, a grand strategy for a hotter Earth. Mark Mykleby was unable to join us today because of some evacuation things that were happening regarding a certain hurricane. But we do have Kristina Mani of the politics department here at Oberlin College, who's going to introduce our next speaker and our next commenter as well. So we're ready, Kristina? Thank you. See you.
Good afternoon. Does this work? The other one is here.
There you go.
Okay, need two here. Stereo. All right, good afternoon. Welcome to this session entitled Grand Strategy for a Hotter Earth. My name is Kristina Mani, and I'm a professor of international relations in the politics department at Oberlin College. It's a pleasure to introduce to you the participants in the session, the remaining participants. Mark is a victim of climate change, we just defined, in not being able to attend. However, we do have Patrick Doherty, who began on my far left, who began his career in international security affairs as a researcher for the Harvard Negotiation Project, and worked for over a decade in the Middle East, Africa, the Balkans, and the Caucasus at the intersection of conflict and development. Obscure. He has been a senior editor of TomPaine.com and director of communications at the Center for National Policy. Later, he was deputy director at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C., where he met Mark Mykleby, and they began refining the idea of a sustainable grand strategy for the United States, which is today's topic. Together with Mark and with Joel McCower, they have co-authored a book hot off the presses this year entitled The New Grand Strategy. I believe you can pick up some copies here. Certainly can order it online. It has some quite innovative ideas. The subtitle is Restoring America's Prosperity, Security, and Sustainability in the 21st Century, so quite a heady agenda. In this book, they frame sustainability as a necessary and even primary obligation of an effective national strategic vision for the United States. That idea is by any measure of past practices a revolutionary one, but as they lay it out in the book, it is doable with the right inputs from business and local level public institutions. And finally, our commentator, our foil for this afternoon, is Michael Northrop, Program Director for the Sustainable Development Grant-Making Program at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, where he focuses on climate change and energy. For over a decade, Michael has been a lecturer at Yale University's Forestry and Environmental Studies School, teaching on environmental policy campaigns. Before coming to the fund, he worked in investment banking and later served as executive director of Ashoka, the International Development Organization. Northrop serves on numerous advisory boards, including New York City Sustainability and Waterfront Advisory Boards and the Rainforest Action Network. So let's get down to exploring the Grand Strategic Plan. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Thank you. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much. And big thanks to David Orr for conceiving of this. And I'm trying to figure out why I was placed last on the day's agenda and between you guys. Well, I'm standing between you guys and drinks, so I apologize for that. I'll try to be quick, and thanks to Michael for suffering through. So the topic is grand strategy in a warming climate. And what I want to do is define grand strategy, tell you what we were working on, and how it came about, because it's kind of an interesting genesis story. And then look at what we put into the strategy itself, and then to take a page, I think it was Bill Ritter mentioned this on his last moment speaking, not waiting on Washington. How can we move, regardless of what happens with the congressional math next year? So what is grand strategy, just so we're not operating in a definitional vacuum? We define grand strategy fairly simply as a very big thing. It's the alignment of the nation's economic engine, governing institutions, and foreign policy to meet a great global challenge. Economic engine, governing institutions, and foreign policy to meet a great global challenge. Grand strategy is a thing, as the millennials are wont to say, and it's a thing that we used in the Cold War and in World War II before that. The story that we're going to tell, and I'll kind of get into some of the precedents in a second, but the story that I want to tell starts in Chairman Mullen's office in the summer of 2009. Admiral Mike Mullen was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was appointed by President George W. Bush, and then his term continued under the new President Obama. After 2 years under President Bush, he realized he was never going to get the level of strategic guidance he needed to do his job. And then after 6 months working for President Obama, did not feel that he was going to get the level of strategic guidance he needed. He felt that the president had a plan for triage, but not for long-term strategy. And for a $500 billion organization, annual budget, you really ought to have some type of long-term plan. And he was seeing all of America's numbers going in the wrong direction, domestic and global. And was especially concerned about climate change and the rise and the reemergence of Asia into the global economy. So, as a good staff officer, he said, I better be ready for when my commander-in-chief comes calling. And he pulled together a small team that included my partner, Mykleby. Mark Mykleby is what his mother calls him, and who was a Marine colonel at the time, and a Navy Captain, Wayne Porter. Puck, as we just learned, cannot be here today because of climate change, because Hurricane Matthew is churning up the coast, and he lives in Beaufort, South Carolina, which is now slated for 9 to 11 feet of storm surge. And I do not know if his house is above that, and neither does he. I just texted him. He sends his wishes, but he's hunkered down in the Georgia mountains. That small team of Navy Captain Wayne Porter and Mark Mykleby, Colonel Mykleby, was assigned by Admiral Mullen to look at the question of grand strategy. Is it time for a new grand strategy, and what should it be? Were pretty much the boundaries of the task. And Admiral Mullen wrapped them up in bubble wrap, gave them an office in the E-wing of the Pentagon, and said, get me your thoughts. 2 months later, they had a narrative. Hunter's been talking about narrative. The first thing they wrote was a narrative, not a strategy. They said America needs a new narrative. And the narrative called for a national strategy in which sustainability would be the centerpiece of our new grand strategic era. So what does that mean? Grand strategy in practice has been the alignment of these three things: economy, governance, foreign policy. When we did it in World War II, we set a pattern for doing grand strategy that I think is still relevant for today. And I think it's a really great framework for understanding how we put a lot of the issues that we've been talking about in this conversation these past 2 days, and we'll continue to have about tomorrow, into relationship, into a framework that can guide intentional action. In World War II, we set out the pattern. We relied on our economic engine to do the strategic heavy lifting. Before we could engage the enemy, the Axis powers, we had to build up a military force. We had 450,000 men under arms, and they were mostly men, under arms in 1939, 1940. By the end of World War II, we would have 16 million in uniform. As Bill McKibben talked about last night, we had an incredible mobilization. That mobilization did not start when Congress declared war. It started fully a year and a half before that, when other forces, FDR and some industry leaders, declared war. But it was our economic engine that was rewired. We created a new industrial ecosystem, and we found new ways of financing that industrial ecosystem. It was a great pattern that we looked at. We also reorganized our governing institutions. We created a war cabinet, war production board, and we created the Joint Chiefs of Staff to manage the war effort. And then we had a two-front war plan. We had a very different foreign policy than essentially isolationism. we transformed every level of that equation because we had a new great global challenge. In Cold War, we did the same thing, but very different challenge. Instead of fighting a hot war, this time we had to fight a Cold War. But our economic engine, once again, was tasked with doing the heavy lifting. We were going to defeat the Soviet Union not in a contest of armies, but in a contest of economic and political systems. And to do that, we had to outperform and outlast the Soviet Union. And so we designed an economic engine to do that heavy lifting, and then we juiced it with a lot of intentional public policy. We transformed our governing institutions. The 1947 National Security Act created the Department of Defense, the CIA, National Security Council, NSA, a whole bunch of institutions. And then we transformed Congress to oversee these new institutions. We did a lot of stuff, and then we obviously had a Cold War strategy that was defined by the term containment. We think it's time to do the same thing. And what's more, what we said was, well, let's see if anybody else is interested in this. So after Admiral Mullen retired, I was able to hire Colonel Mykleby at the New America Foundation, where I was at the time. I had just gotten permission by my bosses to launch a program on grant strategy, and at the time I was the only person really in the civilian side working on grant strategy in Washington. So it was an easy offer to make to Colonel Mykleby, to Puck. Good thing was we had aligned around sustainability being the core strategic imperative. And we said, let's get a white paper to the next president. Got a chance to work with John Fullerton, helping us bounce ideas around at that time. And we said, how might this look? We got an idea, and whoever the next president in 2012 was going to be, whether that was President Romney or President Obama. Thank God it was President Obama, but it was right after Hurricane Sandy, right facing the fiscal cliff. And we got our ideas in when the president called for big ideas. It was the first demand signal for really big ideas in a very long time. By December, I was in the National Security Council staff briefing the team, looking at big ideas, and they asked to include it. Feedback we got very concisely from the president was, meets our ambition, exceeds our expectations. We were looking for big ideas, but we were looking for big ideas in silos. We were looking for big ideas like immigration reform, gun control, mapping the brain. These were the big ideas that they were looking for. Discrete silos with discrete constituencies, and some type of political calculation for how they might make progress. They weren't looking for a new theory of the case. They didn't think that climate change required a level of systemic reintegration that I think this conversation has established very firmly is necessary. But they said, this is great. Could you do three things? Could you go to 2.0? Could you go deeper and go broader? Could you figure out an implementation plan? How does America do grand strategy in the 21st century? And then third, could you figure out the political calculus? How do we create political space in which an administration, potentially with some support in Congress, could actually get something done? We realized to do that we needed a new shop, and we set up the Strategic Innovation Lab just down the street at Case Western Reserve University, partnering with good friend David Cooperrider on the advice of our good friend David Orr, and funded by the generous support of Chuck and Schor Fowler. So we set out to do that, and this is 2.0, which is exciting. But when we were running the set of ideas past some stakeholders, we talked to a guy named Chad Holliday, who some of you may remember from his time as chairman of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, who just recently became chairman of Shell, first American chairman of Shell. Got an interesting resume. He said, look, love the strategy. Love where you're going with getting hydrocarbons out of combustion. Love all this stuff. That's where we're going with Shell. But if we couldn't pass cap and trade with control of both houses of Congress and the White House, there's no way we're going to do something this big, and we need to do something this big. Can you figure out how to make progress on this without waiting on Washington? And so that became our challenge. So that's the preamble. That's the story of our genesis. What are we thinking about grand strategy? And to do that, I'm going to give you a couple more rules of three in grand strategy. So first, the definition is the economic engine governing institutions, foreign policy to meet a great global challenge. So first, I'm going to give you the problem set. What is that challenge as we see it? Because we see it as a little bit bigger, unfortunately, than just climate change. But we think that actually gets you some better solutions to meeting the challenges that we face. And then I'll break into it. Basically, the problems that we see are four. One, obviously, climate change plus destruction of natural capital and ecosystem services, right? We're a 1.5, 350 parts per million shop. We got to withdraw carbon, and we got to get out of combustion as an end use for fossil fuels as soon as possible. But that's not the only challenge. There's three others. One is the reemergence of Asia into the global economy. Reemergence because 300 years ago, they were the big dogs in the global economy, and we were nothing. And they've got a long memory. So they're reemerging after a very interesting 300 years. And they're in power and economic productivity is heading in their direction commensurate with population, with demographics. That's a massive shift in everything. But ultimately it's 3 billion people coming into the global middle class in the next 20, 30, 40 years. Over the last 20 years, we brought 1 billion people in. And if you think we kind of tanked the system trying to bring 1 billion people in, you can imagine what it's going to be like if we try to bring 3 billion under status quo. It's not going to be possible, we know that. Third, our current macroeconomic condition is one we describe as a contained depression. We follow the Financial Times on this. What happened in 2008, 2009 was a depression scale event that was contained by extraordinary action on the part of Congress and the Federal Reserve and central banks around the world, but it is not resolved. The underlying drivers of that depression, the absence of aggregate demand in the economy, is still alive and well. Those problems are not resolved, they've just been contained, and that containment field is still operating after 3 rounds of quantitative easing and extraordinary monetary accommodation on the part of the Federal Reserve and central banks. It's pretty bad, and we're looking at a lot of potential shocks coming at us, and we've got very little policy left to work with. And then fourth is the what we call the resilience deficit. Our systems, our infrastructure, our supply chains are fragile, brittle, prone to shock, disruption, capture, and pointed at the economy of the 20th century. 4 big things: environment, rapid, unmanaged economic inclusion should be a good thing. It's not when it's this unmanaged. Contained depression and a resilience deficit. If you're the President of the United States, you can't make decisions about climate in the absence of thinking about those other 3 things. That's fundamentally what we need to think about. So as Bill mentioned last night, Bill McKibben, if Hillary Clinton is going to if she gets elected and convenes what the platform says she's going to convene, which is in the first 100 days of her administration, a national climate change summit, if we're not talking about those other dimensions of it, we're not talking about a real solution for climate change. It's not going to be, the solution will not be sustainable. It won't work. It won't pencil. We judged that problem set, as big as it is, to not only be interconnected, but also to require a grand strategy. We need a new economic engine. What's exciting, though, is that the way economic engines are structured or just conceived of, the way we look at history, there's great opportunity. Great opportunity that is actually aligned with that problem set, which is very historically convenient, because we'd be really screwed otherwise. And in part, it's because of how we designed the last economic engine that gives us the opportunity for the future one. So the last one, to define how the three terms that you have to kind of get in right relationship for a grand strategy. It's a simple formula: demand plus capital minus stranded assets. Demand plus capital minus stranded assets. What's the demand? What's the call on goods and services in your economy? Capital, how are you financing that call on goods and services? And then stranded assets, what are those things that had value in the past, in the last economy, that for political reasons need to continue to have at least some residual value, right? Demand. In the Cold War, what was the demand for? Well, instead of war material, which was the World War II economic engine, right? We demobilized the economy. Well, we didn't really. We just remobilized it in a different direction. We aimed it at some underlying secular trends. There's a massive shortage in housing in the United States. And if we didn't manufacture demand for suburban housing, it would have been satisfied by building European-style cities. But we leveraged that underlying demand for housing to create suburbs. And that suburban space and that design is at the heart of our unsustainability. It was demand for consumer goods. We had 16 years of austerity under depression and war. And there was a lot of pocket change in American households from not being able to spend money over the last 4 years of full employment. And so we unleashed consumerism in the United States. And then reconstruction materials for Europe and Japan, a story that was critical to creating allies, critical to our strategy in the Cold War, but as a pool of demand dropped off relatively rapidly in the mid to late 50s and was never replaced. That creates an interesting pattern for the future. So where's the demand, where's the capital, and where are the stranded assets, and is there an industrial ecosystem that can handle it, that can engage those aspects? We think the story is actually pretty bright. So there's three big pools of demand: for walkable communities, for regenerative agriculture, and for what we call resource productivity. Let me break those down real fast. Walkable communities. The National Association of Realtors is pretty much saying that boomers and millennials have had it with suburbs. 60% of Americans today do not aspire to another layer of suburban sprawl. They would prefer walkable, service-rich, transit-oriented communities for very different reasons. Boomers, because on average they've saved $45,000 apiece for retirement. They can't retire, they have to keep working, and if they're going to keep working, they have to be in a smaller home and smaller lot, closer to transportation and to job opportunities. Millennials, they grew up in the isolated suburbs in the 80s and 90s, they never want to go back. They suck, they don't even want to own a car. So they don't aspire to be soccer moms and waste all their time commuting. So that plus a good healthy portion of us and some others, I'm Gen X, and you get 60% of Americans wanting that. That's 3 times the demand for housing after World War II. On a proportional basis, it's 8 times in aggregate terms. Regenerative agriculture, we need to increase global food supply 60 to 70% by 2050, and 100% of that has to be regenerative, rebuilding our soils, cleaning up our waterways, fixing our nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, getting back within planetary boundaries. That's a huge, tall order. But it's also a really great story for the American farmer, who's going to have to transform how they grow America and the world's food at a time of high and rising prices, and while changing to methods that create as good yields or better with significantly diminished input costs. It's a great story for the American farmer. And then third pool of demand for resource productivity. If we've got 3 billion people coming into the global middle class in the next 20, 30, 40 years, they need all the stuff of a global middle class lifestyle within planetary boundaries, right? They need, and a big part of that is moving off out of the countryside and into the cities. How are those cities? What's that new housing system like? That's going to take a lot of, it's going to absorb a lot of material. We need a new material stock. We can't build it out of the old material stock. Out of concrete, 5% of, right there, 5% of all carbon emissions globally. We need to innovate the hell out of that. And all the other attributes of a global middle class lifestyle are going to have to be delivered at dramatically reduced levels of energy and material intensity. Great opportunity for innovation, and that's America's specialty. So the extent that we can keep the trend going with manufacturing and advanced manufacturing and innovation and the R&D, we're going to be able to be on the cutting edge of that. Put them all together, you've got knowledge economy on meeting the demand for global goods and services. You've got the rural community floated by transforming our agricultural system. And you've got a hell of a lot of construction jobs creating a new American dream. One that's transit-oriented, dramatically reduced footprint. We think there's a great good news story here. And we've been talking about all these pieces already in these last 2 days. That's the demand side. Capital. We're living in a period of what economists call a savings glut. There's about $11 trillion sitting in assets that return 0 or negative interest rates. The entire Japanese yield curve, out beyond 10 years, is negative. That means they're paying people to hold their money. And as we've heard, institutional investors need higher levels of return. CalPERS, sovereign wealth funds, everybody is underperforming. They need a new investment hypothesis in America and in the world. And it needs to get out of that. We need to invest that money fast. And what Mindy's been doing with INCR has been incredible in starting to frame that debate. What other folks with the Focusing Capital on the Long-Term movement have been doing is part of that as well. That money is getting organized, and it's getting angry. And then stranded assets. Bill McKibben and John Fullerton have really focused on what we think is the new stranded asset story. I think Julie just talked about a stranded asset story that's going to be absolutely critical to get our hands on, which is the labor stranded asset. But there's another piece that happens every time we do an economic shift, right? You have to figure out how do you redeploy labor productively and justly. There's another new wrinkle this time, and it's going to be the oil and gas that we cannot burn. We see the current fight between folks who care about climate change and oil and gas companies who want to pursue their historic business model of focused on combustion as a choice that may not be necessary. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. What if we moved oil and gas out of combustion and into materials? Not consumer materials. We don't want it to end up in the Pacific Gyre or into my wife's bloodstream. She's had her estrogen cycle disrupted by cheap plastics. But what about putting it into the built environment? Right now, there's some incredible work done on non-toxic plastics and polymer systems that are the only thing that at least us and some friends at MIT see as being able to replace concrete, steel, aluminum, and lumber that we can't use anymore if we're going to stay within what our friend from the Carbon Tracker is telling us is our carbon budget on embodied energy in the built environment. So we see this really interesting alignment of demand, capital, and some great stranded asset solutions, including labor and on building materials. And then the question is, what's your theory of change? So you got a great opportunity. What's your theory of change? I want to simplify theories of change into 2. Are we there yet?
We do. We only have about 15 more minutes till people are expecting to have a drink in their hand.
My goodness.
I'm sorry. Sorry to shock you.
I just go on and on and on. So Michael, Do you want to talk about those two theories of change?
Finish. Why don't you sit down
I'll finish here.
And transition to the two theories of change.
Good. So, thanks, Dan.
You're welcome. I'm here to help.
Love you. Two theories of change, we'll leave it here. One is, are you pushing Washington or are you pulling it? So pushing Washington, absolutely necessary. Pulling Washington, also going to be absolutely necessary. I think we're going to have to do both. And I was just talking to Mindy about this. I think we're going to have to do both. We're going to have to push Washington hard. This community is going to have to figure out if Hillary gets elected, and if, and regardless of what the vote situation is in Congress, we're going to have to push hard for getting as much done on climate change as possible. And we're going to have to make a decision. And this conversation, I don't know if you noticed, but there's two kind of options out there on the table. It's kind of, do we go all in on pricing carbon, or do we all go all in on Bill McKibben's and Mark Jacobson's solutions, where we start building out the solar and wind industry of the future on the federal dollar? We're going to have to figure that one out. That's going to be a lot of dialogue, and hopefully we'll get to some of that tomorrow. But we still may not, with all that pushing, we still may not win. So how do we diversify our portfolio and think about how we pull? And what I'm not going to describe is that also in the book, we came up with an idea around a new industrial ecosystem and the financing tool that can pull that new industrial ecosystem into existence, an industrial ecosystem that can be powered from those three big pools of demand while absorbing this savings glut, putting capital back to work, putting people back to work, building a new economic engine on a fundamentally more sustainable footing, while driving our macro climate metrics in the right direction. I think potentially faster than if it's just a zero-sum fight to the death with people marching in the streets. So I'll leave it there.
Okay. And although Michael's been tapping away at his on his iPad, you have no idea if he's taking notes or playing words with friends. I will tell you what it is later.
I've been taking notes.
So he says. But Michael, what is the point of view on all of this from of the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation?
Oh boy. I think I speak for myself mostly.
Okay.
But, anyway, first of all, thank you all for sticking around. I mean, do you have lives? I mean, what are you doing here?
This is it.
But
this is
really,
what matters.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's a testament to David Orr that you guys are all here and paying attention. So again, David, although he did stick us in this terrible position of being so late in the day, 2 minutes before cocktails. You know, when I walked out, I didn't know what I was going to say, but I had a thought as I was sitting here that maybe what I could say is talk a little bit about New York City, because I think it's an example of where we need to go, and New York is actually taking steps that actually sound a lot like what you say we all need to do. You know, New York, about 8 years ago, started working on a climate plan under Mayor Bloomberg, and it continues to this day under Bill de Blasio, the current mayor. And the city has recently committed to an 80% emissions reduction, which is what scientists say is the minimum that we need to do in all of our jurisdictions and in our industries, et cetera. And you know, just think about some of the ways we're going to do it. 70+% of our emissions come from buildings, and we have 1 million buildings. And we aren't just going to build new buildings that are great. We've got to retrofit old buildings. So how do you do that? I mean, this challenge is true all across America and most of the world, except for maybe China, where they're growing new buildings at such a furious pace. We've done a bunch of work on this, and we calculate that if we put a point of sale requirement that all buildings need to be retrofitted, and we back it up with building codes that are advanced, that get us to a net zero building code, so that all buildings in the city are net zero, meaning essentially carbon neutral by 2030. that if we implemented that, we would generate about $6 billion a year in investment. We generate almost 100,000 new jobs every year. We generate about $500 million in tax revenue that could be used to reformat our very old infrastructure and public housing system. And we would save tens of billions of dollars between now and 2050 in energy savings. And we would bring our building code to essentially, our buildings to essentially carbon neutral. So just think about that. I mean, do the climate math and jobs.
I'm sorry. Is it possible to do that in New York with the aging stock?
Yeah, we think it's possible. I mean, the buildings, if you just let buildings go between now and 2050, 90% of the space will turn over in that time if the past is a rule for the future. So it's all going to turn over. So as it turns over, and there will be some new stuff.
You mean sells? It transfers
when it
ownership.
sells, or when people decide to make big renovation decisions. So you capture that too. So it's a totally doable thing. So that's one thing. We've also decided as a city that.
But my question actually, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but my question was actually, can you take a 100-year-old building and make it a net zero building?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, very possible. So, and you'll save money over time.
And it may be easier to do it on a 100-year-old building
than
a 50 or 40-year-old building.
Okay. Okay.
So this is a huge solution, and we're right on the cusp of it. We have a working group of 10 American cities all working with New York and a couple of organizations about how to do this in those cities too. We have about 50 jurisdictions in the U.S. that have said they want to go to net zero energy buildings in their communities, both new and old. So, I mean, that's one of the big things that we're going to do. And as we do it, we're going to generate a new economy at the same time, and we're going to put a huge amount of money to work with real returns. So it's right up your alley. We're also going to, change our energy infrastructure so that it's all renewable. The city's committed to going 100% renewable in city operations, and the way we're going to do it is we're going to put about 2 gigawatts of solar on rooftops and in whatever open space we can find. We have about 6 or 7 gigawatts of peak demand, so that's a ton. And we're going to build offshore wind off the coast of New York City and off Long Island. And we're going to create a massive new industry in New York Harbor that's going to be assembling turbines and servicing turbine farms, wind farms offshore. And there's been a bunch of news about offshore wind recently. Massachusetts just committed to a more than 2 gigawatt wind farm off the state. Rhode Island has just completed a small wind farm. There's another one in Long Island that's just being permitted. So this whole offshore wind thing is going to be a huge industry for the United States going forward. We're also going to change our vehicles, and we're going to amp up our mass transit. We're going to make all those investments. And we're going to put what vehicles do operate in the city are going to be electric. So we're going to move those off the electricity grid also. So again, it's just a whole new economy with new jobs and investment. And it isn't just going to be New York City, but you can see a lot of these models, beginning to build up in New York.
I'd like to request that when you do your list of offshore wind, you include Cleveland.
Yeah, well, Cleveland's got a little bit of offshore wind coming. Yeah. That's right. It's good.
Yeah. Small but mighty. So the elements of the grand strategy that you laid out, is there any part of the economy it wouldn't touch?
No. So my sense is that it would have a propagating reach out as it starts. If it depends on how we start it. Are we pushing, is it policy-led or is it business-led? If it's business-led, then it's going to evolve a little bit more organically, and the starting point is really going to be around tapping into demand for walkable communities, right? And that's going to be about bringing large-scale transit infrastructure programs back to American cities and creating the places where walkability can happen, right? And so that's going to be a lifestyle shift for a lot of people. It's going to be people moving from an average of a 2,400 square foot home to an average of something smaller, but that's the demographic trend. So everything that touches the home and consumer trends, which is 70% of the economy, is going to be affected. And then you're going to have a significant industrial increase as a result. The trick is dealing with industrial energy and embodied energy in all the stuff that we're going to be making. And I think that's where there's a great opportunity for American innovation to really focus, not just innovation in the next generation of an iPhone, which is great for information technology and for emojis and stuff, but we need strategic innovation. And so in material sector, that's really going to be critical. And just thinking about how do we harness renewable energy, and Sandia National Labs is doing some really interesting work on creating industrial heat out of concentrated solar power, so that you can have industrial processes not powered by hydrocarbon fuels. So you're still going to need those high temperature processes, but can we do it from renewable energies? So I think that's kind of.
Can you melt iron with the sun?
Yes. So they're getting about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit out in Sandia's desert concentrated solar power. And what they do, the
challenge is getting the ore to the desert.
That's actually not the challenge because a lot of the ore is there. I think it depends on what your material is. So if it's oil and gas, that's your new material that you're refining and reforming, then you're going to have to get the oil and gas there.
Right.
And so that's going to be this kind of counterintuitive challenge. We are actually looking at a possibility that in order to build a sustainable future, we're going to have to use oil and gas to build it. And that is not our main narrative right now. Keep it in the ground is our main narrative. But as we start to go beyond the conversation about how we create and generate electricity and move our cars, we're going to have to start talking about how we build our buildings and how we build those vehicles. And that gets into some kind of the physics of our material world. And from what I'm told from my friends in our polymer department and at MIT, we don't have an alternative stock of materials that's. I guess I've run out of time. Okay, that's accessible enough to be able to produce the urban environment. Say that China's moving 290 million people into the urban environment in the next 20 years. That's a whole lot of buildings, and they've poured. I think Bill Gates tweeted a few months ago a crazy stat. China's poured in the last 3 years as much concrete as America poured in the 20th century.
Oh my gosh.
They're building 360 full subway and transit systems in China today, right? We've got 25 on the waiting list that the federal government can't fund. It's a whole nother order of magnitude. And so the material economy we're thinking about here, but Bill Ford at Ford Motor Company, the reason he's moving to mobility strategy, essentially selling mobility services, is because most of their sales are overseas. And in a highly crowded international city, you can only sell so many cars. It's just like the analogy is like giving everybody their own elevator car in a building. If you're in a dense urban environment, you don't give everybody a personal vehicle. And so Ford is saying, look, predominantly we're going to have our major commutes, major transportation routes covered by rail, and then individual passenger vehicles and autonomous, however they're driven, will be just providing that final mile service. So it's a massive, massive challenge when you look beyond just converting the American energy system and looking at the full requirements of building the future.
So it's 5 o'clock right now, but I suspect that at least one or two of you may have a question.
Still be alive out there.
What's that?
They might still be alive out there, yeah.
So if you do have a question, we're willing to field it. We've got one down here. It's coming.
I'm from West Virginia, so I don't really need a mic probably because we holler down home. So I came up here to holler because one of the things that we haven't talked about are the people and the land of West Virginia and Kentucky that are in desperate condition right now due to the bankruptcy of the coal industry and the lack of anything but that mono economy. So what is your commitment to the people and land of Appalachia? What is your commitment to invest in bringing them along as they created the Industrial Revolution in this country? What's their future going to be now that coal is gone for?
Sure.
Yeah, this is the justice that Bill Ritter mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. I think it has to be rock solid. I'm originally from Buffalo, New York. I live in Cleveland. My wife's family's from Bluefield, West Virginia, down in McDowell County, West Virginia. When I first went there for a family funeral, I said, "Wow, this is worse than where I served and lived in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, except it has really great highways." And very good, yeah. Turbo folk in Serbia is pretty cool too, but anyways, it's not bluegrass. So what I'm kind of viscerally aware of as we think about the long span of the American experiment is that the American people have migrated for economic reasons for our entire history. And so when I think about the opportunities in Appalachia, I think there's going to be a lot of great opportunities around agriculture, around wind and other renewables, around water resources, around ecosystem services especially. I think we're going to have to make our accounts, as we were talking about a little bit yesterday, I think to make our, as John kind of talked about a little bit yesterday in one of his panels, or maybe it was today, if we're going to make our accounts balanced, we're going to have to bring ecosystem services into the full national accounts. And so I think that's going to really help the mountainous regions of Appalachia. I think you're also going to, personally, I think, think White Sulphur Springs, think about some of the great places, Greenbrier, bringing tourism back to these wild and wonderful places in West Virginia that are connected by train, right? But something a little bit faster than what can get you there right now. I think there's going to be opportunities there. My sense is, I'm not a numbers guy on renewable energy jobs, but as I understand it, renewable energy creates more jobs than coal. So I think we have to go deep. I think West Virginia has already figured out how to do gravity storage. If anybody knows this case, there's a great, very large pool above, forgetting the name of the river, that powers one of the coal-fired power plants and reduces the amount that you have to burn. They experimented with this 40 years ago, and it's a working experiment. It works. So I think that kind of stuff we're going to have to go deep in that community. I think we have to get the larger American economy moving on that trajectory for it to work out. But given our energy requirements and given our agricultural requirements, I'm seeing a lot of opportunity for Appalachia.
It seems to me also that when there are jobs, people move to where the jobs are. And it's hard to pick up and leave, but people, with the fracking boom, people did it all over the country. So there's no reason why they wouldn't do it for a renewable energy boom.
Yeah.
Let's take one final question, I think.
Patrick, let me give you now an easy question. The first time I met Puck was at a fundraiser for David Orr. And I was talking to someone about how someone with a history of blocking the military from coming to Oberlin now works for the military, which is me. And in walks Puck in his full dress military uniform. And I said, listen to this guy. And so the question that I got that night, it's a question to ask you, and for this audience in particular, why do these ideas resonate so much with the national security crowd, especially people in short-haired uniforms?
Thank you for that question.
Absolutely. There's a lot of dimensions to why it resonates. Part of it is it's how they train and how they fight. They have to be able to sustain themselves in battle. And so sustainability is not this greeny concept. And actually, Puck and Wayne didn't know sustainability was an emotionally charged word in the ideology of America. So that's just, it's a different concept, and it has a rationale that makes good sense to them. Second, and I think this is where Admiral Mullen was coming from, if you're going to fight and die for your country, you really want it to be for a good reason. And right now, the reasons aren't very good, and we've got a very high suicide rate in the services, and because we're killing people for no good reason. And that's really hard on a social creature to be able to do that. And then especially to come back into a civilian place where you haven't been respected in your relationship to your family. Nobody understands the stresses. And I think, and then that service and understanding other cultures and the situation of what's going on in the world, because you may have to fight there, or you just fought there, or you don't want to fight there. You understand, you don't have the luxury of ideology to ignore science. And that comes straight home with the Navy right now. What service is right on the forefront of climate change with sea level rise? But it's the Navy. And they've been the most progressive because they're going to have to move their bases. And they're going to have to respond to all the conflicts that are going to arise from those littoral cities that are collapsing because of some type of devastating climate-related disaster. So they get it. And just having worked with Puck for 6 years, there's no tolerance for bullshit. And so understanding what reality is keeps you alive. And I think that's why sustainability is got to be the core centerpiece of any strategic plan going forward.
Michael Northrop, do you have any final thoughts?
You know, I think a lot of the DNA for a successful future outcome is in place, and we're going to have to weave it all together to turn it into an ecosystem that works. But I think we've heard a lot today from people about cities and states and businesses and investors and activists who've really figured out how to, move the needle in all kinds of big ways. And, while I know we all get scared about the climate change problem, and we should be scared about it, there's so much going on that's positive. And, if we left it to federal governments, as many of us have said, I don't think we'd get there, but there's so much going on that's coming up that's driving the system forward. So I can't help but be a little bit optimistic about what our opportunities are, and I think you should be too. So.
Yeah, a lot optimistic. So before we thank these gentlemen for their time, I want to do a little bit of quick housekeeping. You're all on your own for dinner, unless you're going out for drinks with John Powers, in which case he's buying. Right? Is that the deal? Right? But tonight at 8:30, we're back in here in this space to hear from Tom Steyer and the Reverend Otis Moss III in conversation with Oberlin President Marvin Krisloff. Tomorrow morning it's 9 a.m. back here, or across the street again, at the hotel in the same room we were at this morning for breakfast. Program begins at 9. You get there a little earlier. You can get yourself some breakfast. And apparently Arnold Schwarzenegger's here tomorrow. Yeah. Anyway, Pat Doherty, Michael Northrop, thank you so much.
Thanks, man. That was great.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great night.